Hello and welcome to the Sensibly Speaking podcast. This is Chris Shelton, the critical thinker at large, coming at you on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play. I think iHeartRadio now carries this podcast and an assortment of other platforms. And we are going to have another episode of Podcasting Greatness. And this week I am answering questions that I've been asked for a long time. I've had a number of emails, number of people asking me about the subject of martial arts cults. And this is something I've sort of talked about a little bit or dropped hints about when I say, look, there are these groups out there that can develop high control, authoritarian structures that can start abusing their members and stuff and have nothing to do or very little to do, let's say, with religion. You can have groups in politics. You could have groups in sports. You could have a Boy Scout troop become a little kind of destructive cult if they had an off-the-rails or narcissistic, Boy Scout leader. And in this case, with martial arts dojos, according to what I have heard, this is a world that I am not really super familiar with. I've only had a fringe look into it personally. I've only read a few articles about this kind of thing, but Joe Rogan, who is all about, MMA and that world, has talked about this more than a couple times, about fake senseis or fake dojos where somebody's, kind of parading around like a bit of a peacock and doesn't really have a whole lot of skill, but sells his students on the fact that he does. And then they end up paying over a whole lot of money, learn whatever this guy's got to teach them, and then find out they don't really know a whole lot of anything when a real fight happens. And or 1,000 other variations on that theme, because I'm sure you can imagine how this could all work. Well, this week we have a guest who we're going to talk to about this, who's actually lived this. And not only did he live it, but he actually even wrote a book about it. His name is Lewis Martin. He wrote a book called The True Believers, and it is about his experience in a martial arts dojo. And so, Lewis, or Louie, welcome to my show.
Hi, thank you so much for having me, Chris. I've been listening to your podcast, especially a lot recently as I kind of catch up and get up to date. And, I think it's kind of a cliche to say you're doing the Lord's work. And that's sort of weird because you're an atheist, right?
Yes.
But, I think that you're a voice that needs to be out there. And I'm really grateful that you are and given a platform to other people and also speaking about your own experiences in cultism.
Awesome, man. Well, thank you. Thanks a lot. I've been looking forward to doing this show. We had to. I got a little tooth problem last weekend, and we were going to do this last weekend. We're doing it this weekend, and I was really bummed about that because I've been looking forward to this. So let's get to it. I wanted to first kind of set the stage a little bit for the audience on this, other than what I just said, by quoting you from your book. And this is actually from your introduction, and you wrote. Well, it was interesting. There's a book out there. For those of you who don't know, I've mentioned this book maybe a couple times years ago. I haven't really talked about it much at all. And it's a great book. There was an author named Eric Hoffer, and this was written in the 1950s. He wrote a book called The True Believer. And it was one of the first breakdowns. It even predates, if I remember right, I think it even predates Lifton. And the psychology of totalism, the thought reform and the psychology of totalism, which is kind of the seminal book on cults. But this one also goes into it, and it was very, very heavy into communism. It was written during the communist scare. Eisenhower actually mentioned the book in one of his addresses to the nation, which is why I think it gained so much popularity. And rightfully so. It's a well-done analysis of communism, extreme belief, and what he calls the true believer. And I want to quote you here because you read this book and you align a lot of your book to it. And you said, quote, "I define a true believer as someone who has surrendered their personal identity for their group identity. Their goals are totally aligned with the group's goals. Any other roles they have in life are ultimately distractions. Their career is a distraction. Their family is a distraction. Their friends outside the group are distractions. Every criticism of the group is a criticism of them. Every enemy of the group is an enemy of theirs." But then you wrote something that I thought was even more insightful. And you said, quote, "The make-believe world on the mat becomes preferable to the real world. It's no coincidence that most true believers have less stake in the real world than the average person. To them, they gain more than they lose in the changing room." And you were making a point about the changing room. And you go into the dojo, you change your clothes, you leave your outside world outside, and you enter the world of the dojo. And you are talking here about that, and you say they're moving from a world they don't want to a world they do. A world where people bow to you, call you sensei, and defer to you. It's easy to see why true believers tend to get so good at martial arts. They can't wait to get from the changing room to the mat. They can be everything they're not on the outside. I loved that. I thought that was very insightful as in terms of looking into the view and psychology of somebody, in this martial arts world. And I wanted to ask you about this first off before we get into the narrative of your story. Is this, you wrote this, is this common with people you encountered in your world as a martial artist?
100%. And it's common even in martial arts schools that are, do not have kind of destructive cult tendencies. And in that sense, it's completely reasonable. Like, just think about it in terms of athletes, whether it's martial arts or whether it's basketball, a young man or woman that, they don't have a good home life, they don't live in a good neighborhood, and they really embrace sports. And because the rest of their life doesn't really offer them something of value, they just throw themselves into a sport and they become very good at it, and maybe a professional. But of course, that sport is providing them a way to kind of elevate their lives, and it's sort of an escape path from their current conditions. Whereas in the martial art that I was experienced with, it wasn't. You were sort of, becoming in service to the martial art to sort of forward its goals and what it wanted to do, rather than, helping you go forth into the world and, become a better person, or take up a career or something like that. And I think with Hoffer, what was great about Hoffer and the True Believer in the 50s was, one, the word cult, I don't even think was in like the modern lexicon at that point. So I'm not even sure if he mentions the word cult in his book. He phrases everything as mass movements. He talks about mass movements.
That's right. That's exactly right. That's right.
And but a point that he made, and that's why it's so great, because there's no political agenda that we can relate to in Hoffer, because it's 60, 70 years old at this point. So you kind of have to read it and sort of form your own thoughts and opinions. But one thing that rang really true was he talked it about with the threat of communism, or like extreme forms of socialism. He was talking about anything that wasn't democracy, I think.
Right. He was pretty pro democracy. Yeah.
Yeah. But he talked about this idea of disaffected young men, and that in certain parts of the world, the development had not kept pace with the Western world or with industrial world, and that he warns, and this is where I feel like he was talking directly to the president and to people in power. He said, "Hey, you get enough disaffected young men that can't find work and that can't provide for their families, and they're gonna do something radical, and they're gonna embrace a radical ideology, even if the ideology, doesn't really have a lot. As long as it can promise them something better than they have, you're going to have a big problem." And, in martial arts, it is primarily a male environment, although there's certainly females in it, and that's getting much better. But in the martial art that I was a part of, Seibukan Jiu-Jitsu, there was a lot of young men that, it's just like I said in the book, their early 20s, maybe they skipped college, taken a couple classes at a junior college. I joined in 2006, so the recession was about to hit, and then the recession did hit. People's sort of prospects in the outside world started to look a little bleaker, and suddenly that minor reprieve that you're supposed to get from going to your gym or your martial arts school, it becomes more than that, and it becomes sort of a major retreat where you don't want to leave the mat, because in the mat, it's a simplified world where you can live out a fantasy. And that was, all cults have something to offer people that, otherwise people don't join cults. I've heard you say this before, right? Just like the frog, you put him in the pot, you can't throw him in boiling water, but you turn the heat up and he won't know the difference over time. So what we offered of value was fantasy. That was really what we traded in. And every kind of martial arts fantasy that you experienced through film and television, we sort of had an avenue for you to have that outlet. But, it came at a high price, of course.
Yeah, exactly. Well, we'll get into the specifics of that in just a moment. I wanted to first ask, you have, since the time of this, you were involved with this particular group we'll be talking about for about 7 years. And you've since gone on and joined up with other groups, maybe more healthy. What is that true? Have you been continuing to practice in other disciplines since you left that group
Yeah,
as a martial
absolutely.
artist?
That's something I'm personally really proud of, because after Seibukan Jiu-Jitsu sort of fell apart, a lot of its sort of core true believers did not continue studying martial arts. And that is sad, because some of them were incredible martial artists. They were physically really gifted. They had this really strong work ethic, sometimes stronger than I had. And I thought they were really talented. So it was a shame, over the years to kind of meet up with them, a year after I left, a couple years after I left, and just see that some of them were a little lost. And, they were a king in the world of the mat, and they had the black belt and people gave them a title and stuff. And now, they're busting tables, or trying to go back to college a little bit later. And that's not all of them, certainly, but it's, they weren't well equipped by Seibukan to kind of re-enter the real world. And I continued to train, and that was difficult for me at first, because Seibukan was one, I was like a 7th degree black belt in Seibukan Jiu-Jitsu. So it's very hard to go to that and back into a world where you have no currency in another martial arts dojo. They don't recognize your black belt. You don't have the skill that you thought you did to accompany that. But I've kind of clawed my way back up, where I'm a fairly experienced submission grappler, all around submission grappler at this point, mainly in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and I still train regularly. I competed at the U.S. Open last month, and I'm proud and I'm happy with where I am in my training.
Excellent. Well, and that's good, because martial arts in and of itself is perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with it as a subject. It doesn't have a value to it unless you assign it one. And, it can be good, in other words, or it can be bad. It really depends a lot on, in the case of a dojo, it depends entirely on the sensei or the teacher. Because even if the guy's a fake, he doesn't have to. That's the kind of thing that tends to drive authoritarianism, is they're kind of a fake and they know it, but they're just sort of shining people on anyway and get people to believe them. This is where a lot of narcissists live.
Yeah.
They're not all particularly skilled people. They just have a lot of bluster, a lot of arrogance, a lot of conceit, and they can talk a good talk.
Right. That's such a big part of it. Some of the really, really skilled people that I've met over the years, they lack kind of a natural charisma, or they lack even an ability to kind of articulate complex ideas. So they won't necessarily become the great teachers, but in a way they should be, and there's a lot of stories about meeting world champions and trying to get them to teach you something. And it's very difficult, because you suddenly realize, like, oh, they're so good, but they're not a teacher. And then there's other teachers that are outstanding teachers, but they're not necessarily really good. And that's fine. I'm probably one of them, frankly. Like, I'm not a world beater. Like, I think I really enjoy teaching, but at the same time, like, I'm not trying to present myself as something I'm not. That's when you run into some trouble.
Exactly. And that alone, the skill of teaching people a skill, and especially a physical skill, Not an academic, or mathematical or physics or something like that, but like physical. Like it's immediately demonstrable whether you learned it or not. you know, and yet there's a lot of technique and a lot of a methodology to teaching. And how do you do it? How do you do it in a healthy manner? How do you do it in an unhealthy manner? And when you're teaching people to beat up on each other, it's a little bit funny to use words like teaching in a healthy manner because you're teaching people how to beat up on each other, But that's not all there is to it, of course, and there's various depths and levels to it. So, okay, so 7 years. You've mentioned the name of the school. Why don't we get into this? How? I wanted to set the stage a little bit there because one of the most common questions that is asked about cults, and it to me as a person who talks about this stuff, is how do people fall for this stuff, right? How could they? How could you ever, right? Like it's always so obvious that you're walking into a cult situation when it's never obvious and nobody's ever forewarned, and most people are extremely trusting, especially when they're going into a situation where they are the student or the ignorant one, and they're going into a situation where they're trusting that somebody as an authority figure is going to give them the goods. How did you get involved in this group in the first place?
I'll tell you. First off, about the issue of how do people join cults, something I've thought about this is that cults have sort of a life cycle. Most cults can't really sustain themselves beyond a couple decades, and the ones that can are usually the exception to the rule. Like Scientology has managed to just keep going, but most cults sort of fall on the shoulders of one charismatic leader who is too narcissistic to really groom a replacement. So unless one seizes power at the correct time, when that leader falls apart, then the cult will collapse. And then there's also, cults have sort of a rise and fall narrative, which is, they rise to power, they get a lot of people, and then they sort of buckle under their own weight, and there's paranoia that comes in, or maybe the legal system comes in. And by the time we see the Netflix movie, the cycle is complete. And we saw the trailer for the Netflix movie, so we're like, oh, it's a movie about cults, right? But when you're in it, you're in the middle of a life cycle, and it's, you might have started very early. I started fairly early in the life cycle of Seibukan, before it was, I would say, a cult. And, no cults just start. Normally a cult mentality or a cult criteria sort of take over an organization that was not a cult prior to that. So, for people like us, like we have to live in a cult in real time as these sort of things that are serious red flags happen. But, it's hard for us to be like, oh, is it a cult now because this thing happened? Or was it a cult yesterday? And that's why people are like, oh, what was the moment that you knew? And I'm like, there was no moment. It was 7 years. There was a lot of small things adding up. So now I'll answer your question.
Well, actually, thank you for breaking that whole thing down. 100% correct. And I really wish people could get, when did you realize it was a cult? Well, after I left,
Right.
Like, yeah. Anyway,
And
please
actually,
carry on. Yeah.
I did not call Seibukan a cult in the book. And actually, after the book came out, I still did not call it a cult. In fact, I found an old interview I did where I said that it wasn't a cult. And I think there were a couple reasons for that. One, I was a little ignorant as to what a cult is. And I had a very pop culture image of a cult. And I think when the book came out, like the stuff with NXIVM was starting to come out where people got branded and enslaved and stuff like that. And so I was comparing in my mind, and I said, well, no one died in Seibukan Jiu-Jitsu. Like, sure, people's lives were, very negatively affected. I'd say some people's lives were destroyed in essence. But I was sort of like comparing the destructive capacity of different cults. And I didn't really fully understand at that point that there's hundreds of cults in the United States that are existing that no one will ever know about. No one's ever going to go to prison because of it, and they will go through their life cycle and they'll fizzle out. And that's what Seibukan was. And just because it wasn't one of the mega cults where, mass suicides or something like that. It doesn't mean that it wasn't. And then the other reason I didn't call it a cult was because I just wanted to I wanted to give the story the complexity that I felt it deserved. Because these were all real people that I know and that I knew that were involved in it. And I just didn't want to, I just cared about them. And that was important to me.
Absolutely. I mean, who wants to acknowledge that they were part of something awful like that?
Right.
It is not, but I mean, believe me, folks, it is not hard to live in denial about this for a while. It is not even like you have to stretch or think or exert a lot of effort. You just don't even want to go there, Totally
So
understandable.
I should say it was 2006. I
Yep.
was a young man. I was 20. I left home. I grew up in a very small rural town, very sort of homogenous, white middle class, conservative. And I was just looking forward to creating my own identity. And I talk a lot about issues of identity in the book, which is, you grow up, your own identity sort of emerges, but a huge part of it is based on your environment, your family, and then, like a lot of young people do, you leave home either for college or something else. And you have this moment where you're like, oh, I'm in this new environment. People don't know who I am. And I'm kind of free to recraft my own identity. And that's why in those environments, people, they come out as gay for the first time, or, they take up a hobby and they get really, really into it. I had a roommate, he changed his name like twice. Uh, because he just was like playing with the coolest variation of his name or whatever, and I certainly did that. And I was in the correct time and place to become a true believer, and I happened to walk into martial arts school. But if I would have walked in an art theater that had a cult like mentality, I would have joined up with them. It was like I was ready to go. I wanted something to say, okay, like this isn't a part of me. And I walked into, unfortunately, a martial arts studio that was, um, you know, unlike any other in the world that I've really heard of. Yeah, for the most part, really heard of. There, I think we were sort of a pinnacle. That there's a lot of examples of other martial arts like Seibukan Jiu-Jitsu, but what was different about ours was that we were essentially a religion that was masquerading as a martial art. And that's the big difference that's important, because this is not just a story about practicing a martial art that it turns out wasn't particularly effective and the teacher might not have had, the particular credentials that he presented. It is that did happen, but that's very, very common. And I just consider that, fraud kind of on the level of like you bought the $500 course online and it turns out it wasn't that helpful. It's not good, but it's very, very common. And, it's like, welcome to America. That's capitalism, baby. You didn't get what you signed up for. What was different with us was that we were kind of indoctrinating young people into a religious system that was, forming over a period of years, sort of ad hoc. And then we were kind of weaponizing those young people to sort of go out and grow the organization at the cost of advancing their own lives and doing what people should be doing in their lives, which is, starting a career, forming a deep relationship with someone else, maybe getting married, maybe having kids. I'm not saying that everyone has to do that, of course, but there is an upward trajectory that should happen in people's lives where they get a little smarter, they grow up, and they start getting their shit together. And we were retarding that kind of normal growth.
Exactly. Excellent. I really, you have obviously, and I really don't want to comment on this because it's noteworthy. It needs to be noted for my audience that you have clearly put a lot of thought into your experience. You've written a whole book about it. You've done some study about this, and the things you're saying are spot on. I have to say I'm quite impressed because usually I don't see this level of understanding of the process and the more objective reality of what's going on in that situation. So I have to say I'm good job. on the work that
Thanks.
you've done on this. Yeah. Have you found it cathartic to write the book you wrote and do the research that you did?
Oh yeah, 100%. I mean, so much. I think that the, you know, not to jump ahead, but there were serious, abuses that happened later in the dojo, and part of writing the book was as a way to sort of make that right as best that I could. And you know, I can only tell my story. I didn't want to tell other people's stories, but sometimes other people's stories are integral to what my experience was. So I remember a, a kind of internal conflict I had when I wrote this was like, are you just writing this to just get even? Are you just resentful and upset and you want to hurt someone? Because that's not what this should be about. But I remember when I finished the book and I had contacted all the people that I wanted to and kind of asked for permission and said, this is what I'm doing. When I was ready to publish it, I was thinking overwhelmingly of a small group of people that I really cared about, and thinking that like this was gonna make it right with me and them. And that's kind of how I knew that I wasn't on some sort of revenge quest, because otherwise I would have been thinking about, I'm finally gonna get this guy or whatever. And I wasn't thinking about that. And yeah, it was incredibly cathartic. And then after it got published, people contacted me every day for a couple months, and and I was bracing for this backlash, and it never really came. People, even last week, I had a young woman contact me who I had totally forgotten about, and I saw her little avatar on Facebook, and I was like, "Who?" And she's like, "Oh yeah, I was, and this person," and we had a long talk on Facebook, and she said, "Thank you. I had been saying this for years, but I wasn't quite sure myself. Sometimes maybe I was overreacting or whatever, and all of that has really made me feel like I'm in the moral right when I talk about this, because that's important to me."
Absolutely. And sometimes articulating what other people are thinking, they need that.
Right.
And that's the help you can provide, is sometimes just doing that much. So, okay, so you happen to basically wander into the wrong place at the wrong time, and things move forward from there. So what was it that happened? You have this interest, you're going to develop this hobby, martial arts. This sounds exciting. Here we go. Okay, well, what happened?
So I began training in 2006, and Seibukan was in Monterey, California. That was where the headquarters was. And at that point, we were kind of a small martial arts school. We had a good reputation in the traditional martial arts community. My teacher, we called him Concho. That was sort of his title. His real name was Julio Toribio, and he had very excellent kind of credentials in the martial arts world as far as people that he had trained under, and his black belts and whatnot.
Did you do it? I'm sorry. Did you do any research before you actually started? I realized I should have asked you that a second ago.
I did, but that's the problem with when you're trying to evaluate a martial arts school, is you don't know what to really look for. And I remember going in my first night, and I noticed that there were almost everyone was a black belt, and there was 20-30 people on the mat in the class, and maybe 5 to 10 of them were not black belts. Everyone else was a black belt. So just my pop culture idea of martial arts, I was like, oh, this seems unusual, because I thought a black belt was like the pinnacle. They were very rare. And I brought that up to an instructor who said, hey, do you have any questions? I said, man, it seems like there's a lot of black belts. And he said, oh, well, in Seibukan, we have a lot of different levels of black belts. And I should have asked for more information, because that in itself doesn't explain anything. But I was just like, oh, okay. Yeah, sure. And then from that day on, whenever anyone would say to me, like, "Why? How come there's so many black belts here?" I'd be like, well, we have a lot of different levels of black, So it's a lot when you start training martial arts. You're not equipped to answer the questions. It'd be like if you took a tour of a food processing plant. how do you know if everything's to code and if they're following the right procedures? Like, you just don't know. You're at a huge disadvantage.
That's
Um,
right. That's right. And that's the thing about researching stuff is it can you can fall into the most obvious holes if you don't know anything about what you're getting into. So, yeah.
and the internet was not what it is now back then. So even now, when you Google Seibukan Jiu-Jitsu, they clearly got a guy that knows something about search engine optimization, because they're sort of uh, kind of dominating page one. I think I might be on a little bit of it, but I don't put the word Seibukan Jiu-Jitsu kind of up front in my book all the time. So it's not as mentioned as it would be. But yeah, back then it was very difficult to kind of verify who people were. Nowadays, it's considerably easier, and that's why traditional martial arts are sort of being ran out of the community, because there's just such a huge level of scrutiny. I mean, we're on a witch hunt nowadays to find any martial art that's not 100% effective and get them, basically.
That's cool. I mean, in terms of cleaning house, I'm kind of getting from that flow or that idea.
Yeah, like a really popular Instagram is McDojo Life. There's another one called Fake Black Belts, and an old website that's been around for decades is Bullshido. And these are
I,
people that their mission is to root out fake martial arts and fake black belts. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I think policing our own community is fine. However, in a weird way, I'm oddly defensive of them, because I say, like, hey, people are allowed to practice fake martial arts. Um, at some point, it's the instructor should be held accountable, but also the students have a part to play in that. And again, that's where I come back to, like, Seibukan. I always stress this: like, we were more than just a fake martial art. Like, we were a cult. We had a religious aspect that, and getting back to my kind of journey. So you start out and you're practicing martial arts, and it's sort of like what you see is what you get, and it's very kind of traditional Japanese martial arts, very well organized, kind of mechanically sound, and there's something in it that we called the Seibukan philosophy. Of course, we would never call it a religion. Like, that wouldn't work. We couldn't be like, oh, we have a religion that you could study. So we called it the Seibukan philosophy. And it was sort of like an onion, like it had different layers. And the top layer, I'll divide it into like three components. So the top layer was sort of a Western self-help system that you'd see something kind of like Tony Robbins, very inoffensive, sort of generic buzzwords like we're gonna help you reach your maximum potential, no limitations. The sort of core dogma that they would hit you with in the beginning was awareness, assessment, and action. And uh, on its face, that doesn't sound scary at all. Awareness, assessment, action. It works good for self-defense, which is how they framed it. Awareness. You're in a parking lot at night. You need to be aware and look at the dark corners or whatever. Assessment. You see someone coming towards you. You don't know what their intention is. You make a decision if they're a threatening person, and then action. Decide what's appropriate to do. And so that makes total sense. And I still think about that sometimes today. Like, it's a good rule of thumb. And then as you train a little more, you start talking about, well, how could you use awareness, assessment, action sort of in your everyday interactions with people, in your relationships, with your personal health, and with your financial decisions and things like that. So then, we start leading into just what I said, like, there's another group of three buzzwords, which is your health, your relationships, and we called it your abundance, which is code for money. And so we said, so those are three words that it's important to maintain. Like, think about how you're maintaining your health and your relationships with other, and then your abundance, which that was a whole coded language, because we were charging people a lot of money, and so we talked about abundance a lot, which is it's just like you would see at a lot of churches. Hey, if you give money, you're going to get a lot more money back somehow.
it was it actually a kind of prosperity gospel you guys were preaching in that sense?
Absolutely, yeah, 100%. This
Okay.
guy gets it.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I've been down that road many times.
Yeah. So yeah, right. I'm curious to know with your yeah, we could
Oh
talk all
yeah.
day about contrasting it to Scientology.
Yeah.
So so that was sort of the top level of the onion, which is sort of a generic self-help system, which was, kind of non-threatening, that you could introduce to a colored belt, white, yellow, green, whatever. Then when you get kind of deeper into it, you start talking about the elements of nature, the four elements: water, earth, wind, fire. It was a different order, but and again, it's used in a martial sense, which is, hey, fire is like your aggressiveness and how willing you are to attack and be offensive. And if you're a really timid person in the dojo, then we would say, hey, like, let's try to like up your fire a little bit, make you more assertive. And then, so on and so forth. Earth was like your stubbornness or your willingness to commit to a course of action. Wind was sort of your ability to interact with people, and so on and so forth. uh,
Was
in
this all fully developed the day you walked in, or was this was an ongoing development as you
Correct.
learned? Okay.
Yeah, some of it was planned out, and a lot of it we just sort of made up as we went along. I know Concho made some of this up, because the students were thirsty for more of the religion. Uh, then we get into the elements of nature, and again, like, that's not too scary. Most people have heard about things like that, and it's just like horoscopes or whatever. So it's like, oh, okay, I can kind of get on board with that. And then we started kind of going deeper, which is um, the the Japanese Shintoism that was really intertwined. Seibukan drew heavily on the Shinto religion, which, if people don't know, if you think like Native American shamanism, which is, a little bit vague, it's more ill-defined, but it's sort of like worship of nature. Japanese Shintoism, that was sort of the dominant. It's not even a religion, but it was the dominant kind of spiritual practice in Japan prior to Buddhism being introduced. And if you go to Japan today, you see that Shintoism is just a part of their culture, that there's all sorts of signs and sort of etiquette niceties everywhere. Just like in America, Christianity is a part of our heritage, and you'll see Christian imagery everywhere, and people don't think about it, but it's just like, we were founded by, Judeo-Christian cultures or whatever. So we started getting more into the Shintoism in our take on the Seibukan, or Seibukan's kind of religious take, and that only would happen kind of later after you became kind of a black belt. And the way that would manifest is the elements. We would introduce like 3 additional elements beyond the fire, earth, wind, water, which was the void, consciousness, and balance, which then we started getting into God and the higher power and your own consciousness. Then we started kind of getting into the animal worship. We had an animal that corresponded with each element of nature. We wouldn't overtly worship them, but I mean, they were sort of presented in Shintoism. Animals can be deities. There's all sorts of old Japanese stories about, the fox that's actually a spirit that would, lead people in the forest or things like that. So we had a lot of that.
Is that kind of
And
a spirit animal sort of thing?
exactly.
More of a mascot kind of thing than you're
Yeah.
worshiping it, but it sort of symbolizes or represents you, or represents this concept that you can think with.
Right. And kind of the furthest that we would go is, so in Shintoism, they have a lot of shrines. And if you go in Japanese households today, there'll be a lot of shrines. They call it like well, we called it the shomen, which is a Japanese word for, kind of like a shrine that's at the head of the household. And so we would put the different animals, front and center, like a statue of them at the shrine. We would bow to them, and then we would kind of like meditate on the wisdom of the bear, or the fierceness of the wolf, or things like that. So again, like, it came right up to that line, and it just stopped short, and you were never sure. You're like, man, am I worshiping animals? No, right? I didn't pray to an animal, but at the same time, I just bowed to a statue of an owl. And
Right. It's clearly a little confusing.
and then just to wrap it up, like, then we started getting into really, really deep stuff, which is, we had 21 concepts that were spread out amongst 7 gates. And this is the third level. So the second level was like the Shinto stuff. The third level was how our religion coincided with progression in the system of Seibukan, which is that as you get promoted and you get belts, then you are kind of considered that, okay, you've ascended this like sort of spiritual ladder to enlightenment. Something I'm sure very similar to like maybe the OT levels, right?
Oh,
Uh,
the entire bridge to total freedom. All of it is a level by level status climb through
right,
the levels of Scientology, and it gives you social status. It gives you, you're paying more money, so of course it's taking from your finances at the same time. But the whole theory is the prosperity gospel. Every level you do is supposed to make you more able, more effective, more efficient, more spiritually aware.
right.
I think it's probably same for levels in the group you were involved in. But yeah,
Yeah.
please carry on.
And then you get into numerology was very important to us. So there was so we believe that the three most powerful numbers were 3, 7, and 21, which are multiples of each other, which is why there's awareness, assessment, action, and then there's health, relationships, abundance. Everything had to be a triangle because we
Right.
believe the triangle was the ultimate symbol. Um, so then, you know, there was 7 black belt levels and there was 7 gates, there was 21 concepts, and you were expected to kind of memorize them. And you had to write papers on them, to the point where getting a black belt at one point, or at a certain point, it was equally mental and spiritual as it was physical. And you really had to have a strong grasp of the Seibukan philosophy, as we called it, in order to progress, almost equally as important as sort of your physical skills, which became less important over time. And because it was so tied in with progression, um, progression meant something different in Seibukan than other martial arts, which is, you know, most martial arts studios, you train, your skill goes up over time, and one day an instructor comes to you and says, "Hey, I think you're ready for your brown belt." And it's, you know, often there's very little fanfare behind it. You're awarded a brown belt after a class, people clap, and you take a picture for the gram, and it's all good. But in Seibukan, because progression meant that you were kind of one step closer to you know, healing was sort of the ultimate goal. That was the 21st concept, was healing, self mastery. um, our belt promotions were a big freaking deal, and we had these huge celebrations, and it was very kind of choreographed, very very ceremonial. People were crying, um, and it was a
Wow,
high.
tears.
Yeah, I
So,
cried. I mean,
wow. So, okay. And every level.
yeah, it was
Okay.
it was an emotional payoff, and it was structured to
Yeah.
be an emotional payoff, and
Right.
this moment of recognition, and it was a high that once you got it, you wanted the next one, baby.
Right.
Yeah,
There it is. There it is.
yeah,
It's a consistent component across these groups, that the thing that's one of the things that is keeping you there is that euphoria, that awe, that generation of um, something larger and bigger and more grand than you, that you are part of, and you get to ascend. This ascended masters concept is centuries old,
yeah.
and it's just been a model, and really it's just a framework, that you can build a belief system on. And you literally just described beautifully how you can progressively invent and build a system. And yeah, the triangle, the 3-pointed system, it's easy. It's not hard to come up with 3 elements at a time that have some relation to one another. Hubbard did it. I mean,
Hmm.
that's why I'm so like I love all the stuff you're describing here, because it's so classic. It's in Scientology you have the S. The Scientology symbol is an S and double triangles. There's 2 triangles interlocked in the S, and the top triangle is knowledge, responsibility, and control, which are supposed to intertwine, work together. The more knowledge you get, the more responsibility you can take, the more control you can have over something.
Hmm.
And that's supposed to equal that total is supposed to give you mastery or control over things. It's how you lead. It's how you lead. It's how you're in charge. Is you focus on knowledge, responsibility, and control.
What about the bottom one?
The bottom one is more widely used in Scientology, and it is the ARC triangle: the affinity, reality, and communication. And these three things, affinity is degree of closeness or liking for something. Reality is how real, how much agreement there is between you and others. And communication, of course, is how you create affinity and reality as you communicate. Verbally or non-verbally, any kind of communication counts. You add all these three components up and you get understanding. This is how you understand anything, is you communicate with it, you have reality with it, and you have some degree of liking or affinity for it, whether it's a person, thing, subject, whatever. And ARC is talked about probably more than almost any other concept in Scientology is the ARC triangle. It's a very, very widespread, understood principle in Scientology. And Hubbard made a great deal, got a lot of mileage out of this with these two triangles and with this kind of thinking. Yeah.
Do you think that those triangles could be a positive model for kind of interacting with the world, or do you think that just there's no way that it could end up being healthy in the long? What do you think about that?
I don't happen to think that there's anything inherently evil or wrong with affinity, reality, communication, or knowledge, responsibility, and control. Or I could sit here for an afternoon and I could create probably 5 other triangles of similar value, right, using these kinds of ideas. I don't have a problem with that. What I have a problem with, and what I think probably I'm thinking we'll probably run into with your group as well, is the fact that the dial gets turned up to 11.
Right.
That's the problem. It's not that these things are unworkable. It's not that these things don't have some usefulness or some helpfulness to them. But when you start making claims that this is universally how people act, this is universally what people respond to, you could go to China and use the ARC triangle just as effectively as you could use it here. On any one individual, it will always work 100% of the time. If it doesn't, you did something wrong. Right? That starts opening the introversion door, that it's not that this principle doesn't work. This principle always works. So if it doesn't work, then you're the one who's in error, right? And that's where that's where you open the door to faith and dogma and enforced belief and invalidation of the individual, who's honestly trying to make this thing work, but it doesn't always work. There are no universally workable principles. There's always exceptions.
That was a big thing with the actual martial arts training itself, which was that one thing that is just common knowledge now to me and to many people, which is that all techniques, there is no technique that's 100% effective 100% of the time. Techniques can be modified, and I personally experience this because I'm very small. I'm like 120 pounds.
Wow.
So because I'm at one end of the spectrum, there's some techniques that if someone is even close to the other end of the spectrum, approaching 200 pounds or 170, I'm certainly going to have to modify certain techniques because it's just the physics don't always work. It's hard for me to handle that much body weight and manipulate it in a certain way. And in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, which I study now, that's just accepted, right? It's accepted. Like, hey, you're gonna have to modify some of these techniques. Like, you can't hip toss a 200-pound man. Your body cannot bear that much weight. It's just not gonna happen. But in Seibukan, that there was a huge conflict of interest because that would lead into admitting that possibly some of the techniques didn't work all the time. And that would mean that maybe the person that created them, which in our case was our founder, Concho, maybe he made a mistake. Maybe this doesn't work. So it was always like, no, you can hip toss this 200-pound dude, Louis. You're not doing it correctly. You're not doing it. And I'm like, I cannot. And then, your instructor, he's 175 pounds. So he's like, I'll do it right now. It's easy. He's like, see, I used no strength. And I'm like, did you though? Like,
exactly.
Yeah. So that was something that in Seibukan, we were always trying to sort of protect the fantasy of, hey, no matter how small you are, you can do anything to anybody. And that's one of the big myths of martial arts. It's true and not true, which is the whole size doesn't matter myth.
Um,
Size absolutely matters. It's an important thing. Like I can, if someone has no training or no experience, on the mat, regardless of their size, like I will probably be able to defeat them in a match or in a fight. But as they get some experience, even if they don't have as much experience or skill as me, their size will kind of compensate for their lack of, and it'll be tremendously difficult for me, no matter how good I am. And that's just common knowledge in modern martial arts. But in traditional martial arts, they're so obsessed with this narrative of the small guy that is able to beat all the big guys that sometimes they have some blinders on a little bit.
well, big time, and I know this will be a controversial statement, but I'm not. That's never stopped me. Michael High White, who I love watching in movies, is a black martial artist and movie star, and he talked about and got in a lot of trouble for saying that Bruce Lee doesn't really have the weight that he has or the size that he has, and he made some comparisons that pissed a lot of people off because you can't criticize Bruce Lee
Right.
ever, anywhere, under any circumstances, right?
Right.
And and I look at that from the outside and I kind of go, really? Really? And I'm only laughing about it because there's this mystique to it. And of course, the thing with Bruce Lee is he's become an icon. He's not even a human being anymore. I mean, that's just kind of
Totally true.
yeah, that's just where Bruce Lee is at. But these guys who are still alive, Chuck Norris, Michael High White, these other guys that you can go challenge them. They're still alive. You can go see them fight. You can watch videos of them fighting. You know where their skill set's at. Bruce Lee never competed. Bruce Lee never. You don't have any video of Bruce Lee actually fighting somebody else anywhere, hardly anywhere. Some grainy black and whites from his early days, and that's about it. So, but we've risen him to this level of mystique, and it speaks to the only reason I thought of all this is because again, I'm not claiming expertise, um, but yeah, size does. It just seems common sense wise. You could look in on this from the outside and go, well, yeah, of course size matters. What do 300-pound guy versus some 150-pound guy? You've got to change up your game somehow with
Right.
that. So to think there's some universally workable wrist lock that's going to get every single person, or whatever master move you have. Yeah, it seems to me that would be a recipe for disaster under any circumstances.
And in that sense, the physical martial arts that we taught in Seibukan, um, that was where they became harmful because uh, we sort of propagated this myth that, and I would see it all the time. And I'm sure when I was a younger student, people did it for me, which is a young person comes in the dojo and they're very timid. They're not sure if something can work, and you want to boost their confidence a little bit. So you grab a really big guy and you're like, hey, do this wrist lock on this big guy. And of course, he's sort of in on the game and he lets you kind of hurl him and toss him back and forth. And then, in the short term, you feel very empowered and it's a net positive. But if that myth is kind of propagated day after day, we're doing tremendous harm to you because you're going to come up against someone that has some real intentions. One of the mottos that we had in the dojo was no challenge, no resistance, no injury. Again, it's the group of three. And no resistance was an important part of that because we believed that you should not resist your partners in training, because that if you were to resist them, you would get hurt because the techniques we were doing were very dangerous and we didn't want to hurt people. So we had this kind of motto of no resistance. And that in hindsight was dangerous because our no matter how legitimate our techniques may have been, our training methodologies were not correct. So we were never implementing those techniques against any sort of realistic style opponent. And then, when I left Seibukan and I had many black belts in different martial arts, and I was a seventh dan in Seibu, I was at the pinnacle. It was the highest rank that you could really get in the art at that time. And went to a school where it was full live sparring, and I just got the floor wiped with me. by people that have been training for months. Kids that have been training for months, and these kids. They knew 2, 3 techniques tops, but they had practiced it at full speed, 100% training, and I had not. And that was a big eye opener. Uh,
Oh,
but
I'll bet that was a day had your eyes a little wide.
yeah, and back then I was still training in Seibukan. It was very unpopular that I went and cross trained, and I know why, because they're like, oh well, if people go cross train, they might start realizing that this isn't all that. And then I went back to Seibukan and I sort of started infecting the school with just like little at first, but like I would start seeing people demonstrate stuff, and I'd be like, I don't think that works at the other place I'm going. And that was a problem, and that didn't happen until years into it. I was a true believer for the first probably 5 years, and I didn't cross train. I was 100% dedicated to the martial art, and I was even on the verge of making some dangerous decisions. I was thinking about dropping out of college, so I could be sort of we had a program called the Uchideshi program.
I was just about to ask you about this because it seems this perfect segue into it.
Yeah, so most cults are not 100% true believers. There's people that are on the periphery and are sort of casual. They have outside lives, but every cult needs a core group that is driving the enterprise forward, and those are the true believers. And with ours, it was funny because who was the young woman that was in the Indian cult that was in a couple episodes
Oh
back?
yeah, Sarah Landry.
Yeah, so she had her core program that everyone was always being kind of driven towards. You had the C program. Is that what it's called?
The C organization. Yeah, that's right.
Right, and that sounds like maybe it was similar. And
Oh yeah,
it's
the
always,
core dedicated 24/7. Do
yeah,
anything.
and
Do anything for
it
the group.
always comes down to like whatever we call it. It's full time indoctrination, and it's a lot more money.
That's right.
So,
well, at the Sea Org, it's a billion years.
oh yeah,
So,
billion-year contract.
all you're handing over is, your life. No biggie. Just your whole life. That's all.
We had a program called the Uchideshi program. Uchideshi means like inside student, and it's popular in Japan, which is you have a live-in student. They live in the dojo, and they stay there overnight. They clean it. They sometimes they'll cook for the instructor, and they are it's Luke Skywalker on Dagobah with Yoda. That's kind of the image.
Okay.
And we definitely tried to capitalize on that. And so originally, the Uchideshi program was an intensive year-long training where you sign a contract and you say, okay, I am agreeing that I'm going to be 100% dedicated to the martial art and to Kancho for 1 year. I'm going to go to every class, do all the seminars, and to some extent, I'm going to be Kancho's kind of like, helper too. I'm going to help him, run errands or whatever. And the expectation is when that's done, I have, I get sort of my bona fides are set. I have this credential that I trained intensively under a master for a year, and then I'll go on and I'll create my own school.
Okay.
A Seibukan school, of course.
Well, of course.
Yeah, to which you'll pay your fees to Kanto every year.
How much would this program cost?
So I know for the bulk of its life, it was $500 a month.
A month, okay. All right.
Yeah.
That is not a small contribution.
I mean, that's insane. I mean, I don't know what 500 times 12 is, but like you could almost go to a college.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. No, that's $6,000 a year. That's what you.
Yeah.
That's
So
what you're
that's a state college, and in fact, when I was considering being an Uchideshi, that was sort of the thought, which is like, well, I could take my tuition money, and I could spend it on this because they're almost the same. And
exactly.
The only reason I didn't was because my parents would kill me. And it wasn't their money. I was paying my own money to go to college, which is debt. I was getting in debt to do it. And that was the other thing, was like, well, I really can't. I can't leave, thank God, because I think I got more of a return off my college education than Uchideshi. But so the Uchideshi, when I first joined the dojo, there were like 4 or 5 of them. And they were very, very good. And they pretty much all did go form their own schools. So the program was kind of working as intended. Um, but what happened was everyone, the real reason people envied the Uchideshi was they were the closest to Kancho personally. They had that relationship, right? So the program kind of morphed that it was less about the training and it was more about the access. You were sort of paying for access to the master. And then a couple things happened. One, people started doing the Uchideshi and they never went and made their own school afterwards. Uh, because they really didn't want to. And in some ways we didn't equip them to, like we made them really good martial artists, but like you need other things to create a business dojo. You need to know how to get a business license, how to pay your taxes, and there's so many other parts of it, how to buy a lease a building and stuff. So
This is what literally every single dentist and chiropractor learns after they graduate
right, I
from their
imagine
school.
so.
Everyone. And in fact, I just have to comment. This is one of the ways that Scientology has an inroad into these folks because they have a business consultant wing. That's one of the ways they get so many dentists and chiropractors and doctors is they go in with a management consultancy package that has nothing to do with the Church of Scientology at first glance, right?
Oh,
It just
it's like a DBA kind of thing, like you don't even know right away.
it's a Hubbard management system,
Oh,
right? And it's a rollout package of about 7 steps that take an extended period of time to implement in your business, and you put all those in place, and you've got a little organization that looks exactly like a Scientology organization structurally. And this is
huh.
supposed to be the best model to build your business on. And this is one of the ways that Scientology has made millions and millions of dollars is through this business consultancy.
It's actually a very, very smart idea.
It's a
Unfortunately,
brilliant idea.
yeah, it's a
Yeah, they
very
came
smart.
up with it in the 80s.
Seibukan should have done that. They would have, and they could have legitimately served people, depending on how it was implemented, of course. But
Yeah.
that was always a big problem with us, which is that as we got deeper into Seibukan, our ability to function in the real world got hampered. One, because we didn't acquire skills that we would normally be doing at this phase in our lives. Um, we were still living in crashing on couches in friends' apartment. We hadn't signed a lease on an apartment, let alone we're trying to get a commercial building for our own school. And then on top of that, we were so deep in the philosophy, we were kind of programmed. It was difficult for us to talk to other people, but I'll get to that in a second.
Yep.
So Uchideshi program, basically it was spiraling. It started escalating, which is one, people started doing multi-year contracts because they didn't want to give up their access to Concho, and they didn't really want to start their own school. And we had people doing 4 or 5 years as a Uchideshi, and
Wow.
and at that point I think they would cut deals and they would pay probably less money, which I
Sliding
always thought was
sliding
funny.
scale for 5 years.
Yeah, and everything was negotiable,
Right.
and people were just like, oh, Concho's so generous, like he's only charging me $200 a month to do another year or something. And I'd be like, well, maybe he just knew like 200's better than nothing. Like,
Right.
he knew that's what you could pay.
Yep.
And that's what started happening. People at this point, we started growing, and we opened dojos in the next town over in Santa Cruz, and then we opened them in Carmel, and then in other parts of Northern California, Alaska, Oregon, Washington, and then suddenly Europe started happening. We had this Hungarian cadre, Switzerland, Mexico, Puerto Rico, and someone comes from Mexico and it's like, hey, I can't do a year with you, and I can't, but could I do 6 months? And it's like, yeah, 6 month Uchideshi. And then someone comes, oh, can I do 3 months? Can I do 1 month as an Uchideshi? And then at the end, it just got ridiculous. Oh, I'm here. I can only be here a week and a half. I'm an Uchideshi for that time. And basically, it just became like the VIP program.
Right. Morphed into
And
something else.
and at one point, we had more Uchideshi than regular students in certain classes, and they were all just sort of like strutting around, being like, "Oh, I know things about Concho that no one else knows," and it got ridiculous, but it also it kind of got harmful, and it was just a way to kind of keep. I think students in general, not just Uchideshi, but they had this sort of codependency after a period of time, which is they, Seibukan was supposed to be preparing us to go out in the world and live a better life, be better to other people. And it got to the point where not only could we not go out in the world, we didn't really see it as safe anymore. And, people thought that Seibukan was a viable career path, which, it absolutely was not. We had people trying to create dojos and failing over in the later part of our, in the early times, people would start dojos and they would work, they'd be successful. But in the last 4 years or so, like almost all of them failed, and almost all of them have failed to this day.
That is very interesting. Speaks to the system as well. Um, I have so many questions. Let me ask you this first. There is a complete, by the way, there is, and something I've not really ever talked about a whole lot, because I never really looked at it this way, but you're bringing something to mind here with this whole Uchideshi, Uchideshi? Uchideshi, yes, the Uchideshi program. There's a complete parallel in Scientology.
Yeah.
Yeah, in the 1960s, L. Ron Hubbard went to England and he set up shop over there and he started calling people from all over the world to come to England to train under him personally. And he delivered a class called the St. Hill Special Briefing Course, which ended up going on for like 7 years. Continuous enrollment. People would come to England on their own dime, pay him an exorbitant amount of money to be lectured to by him 2 or 3 times a week, and get supervision by him on their counseling, on their auditing procedures. This was where they were going to be getting the latest and greatest bleeding edge developments, because it was right there in England where Hubbard was developing it. And they were full-time, full-time there. They were there for months or even years, depending on the person. And this was, like I said, a continual enrollment thing. And he always had, a few hundred people out there. And this is when Scientology really took off, because what he was training them to do was he was training them at the highest levels of Scientology, and they would go out and start a Scientology group. This is how they opened up Seattle. This is how they opened up a ton of places, actually Hawaii, where these St. Hill graduates, as they were called, would go open up Scientology in new countries, new areas, and this was actually, if I have it right, this was the period of time of the most international expansion of Scientology, where more churches and groups were opened up by these St. Hill graduates, and Hubbard. This was also the period when Hubbard's income skyrocketed, took way off.
Right, I imagine.
Yeah, so I just find it funny that there's such a parallel there, because even when you first told me about this and I was reading about it in your book, I didn't connect those dots. But then as soon as you talked about just now, when we were talking about them going up and opening up other schools and failing at opening up those other schools, by the way, because that happened in Scientology too. They weren't all successes.
Yeah, now that I think about it, virtually every Seibukan affiliate dojo that ever opened was started by an Uchideshi. And it was sort of seen as like, hey, your training's all well and good, but if you really, want to go to the next level and open your own school, this is what you have to do. And for a lot of us, so we were at the headquarters dojo in Monterey. So we saw Concho all the time. And it was like, but when we would have these huge gatherings twice a year, where all the dojos would have to come in and, bring their students, and it'd be a big seminar. One, they saw us as gods, the other students. They're like, wow, you get to talk to him every day. What is he like? What is it like training with him? So we really enjoyed that status. And then I felt some of the mystique, because, at that point I was a high ranking student, and the mystique of Concho would transfer on to people like me, and people would say, hey, come out to, Mendocino, teach a seminar there. We'll let you stay with us. We'll pay for your travel, which I did. And, it's easy. Like my ego was getting stroked too. I was like, this is great. They think I can do all sorts of shit that I can't. Really do.
Isn't it intoxicating? I can't tell you how many times I experienced that in Scientology as a Sea Org member. You go to a place, everybody respects you automatically, calling you sir. all
Yup.
that kind of stuff. Oh, it's intoxicating, man. You have to be a god to resist that kind of stuff,
And
you know.
imagine being 22
Right.
and having putting on a black belt and people call you a special word. They call you Renshi or they call you Kiyoshi, and this is like your special title. I mean, it's like who wants to give that up? It's like, what am I gonna go work at a Subway, or am I gonna go to this place where like I'm this special word, and people want to take private lessons with me, on which I get to keep 40% of the fee for that, because of course the rest should go to uh, Pancho. But
Of
yeah,
course it should.
it really is intoxicating, and it was funny that different talking about the prosperity gospel, because Uchideshi were paying such exorbitant fees, they simply could not progress, certainly financially, in their lives. They were kept in poverty. I mean, they had to not only come up with their Uchideshi fee, but then they also had to find some place to live. At different points, we had places that we could give them to live. We bought an apartment one time, and it was a large apartment, basically right upstairs from the dojo, and it could fit, I mean, 6, 7 people could live in there, 10 people, I don't know. Um, and then that even made the experience more fun, because then it was like summer camp, and it's like, oh, come live with the other Uchideshi. But that degenerated into this complete cesspool of debauchery and just like super heavy drinking, and a bunch of 20-year-olds that had no, didn't even want to clean their room, let alone. That place became a super dark place. I think there were some sexual assaults that happened there. Um, and there were drugs coming in and out at certain points, probably not like hard drugs, but um, it, so anyways,
Yeah, yeah, I'm fascinated by that. I mean, it speaks volumes about the actual character of the teachings and what these guys were learning, I should say. I don't want to
right,
put it. I don't want to lay everything at the feet of the guy, because it's a codependent relationship. Both sides have responsibility for what's going on in a cultic
yep,
relationship. It's not complete victim, master BDSM sort of a situation. Um, that being said, I'm not referring to children when I say stuff like that, and obviously I'm not referring to giving anybody a pass or saying that rape victims are responsible for what happened to them. That's not that. Let's not go there. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the fact that you have these young men who are going into the system of this religious system that you described, where they're learning these levels of discipline and they're learning physical discipline, but then they're also 20-year-olds and they're acting like a bunch of
right.
knuckleheads, you know.
And the sort of male female dynamic was interesting, because this is a problem in all martial arts, which is it's not just male dominated in terms of attendance, but males are attracted to martial arts probably in greater numbers. I mean, they definitely are. But as far as the reason why, one reason that makes sense to me is that it's a physical contact sport, and that especially men, when they get done with school, they don't have as many avenues to play sports and things like that. So this is something, and as our society, starts scrutinizing men more carefully than in the past as far as their indiscretions or the way they treat women, a martial arts studio, it seems like a safe place to just be a gross man, and just tackle someone, and just do kind of traditionally masculine things. Um, and in Seibukan, there's obviously a power dynamic there all the time, which is the master student dynamic, teacher student dynamic, and it's physical in nature, which is a whole different dimension. Which is, in order to teach someone martial arts, to some degree, you need to physically dominate them in the course of training. And then when you throw a woman into that mix, especially a young woman who is, maybe had some sort of negative experience, physical experience, and that's why they're here in the first place, and then you have a young man teaching them, it's really a recipe for potential disaster, which is, these young men. And I never dated anyone that I taught or trained with or anything like that, and I'm happy about that. um, but they just can't help themselves. You're in your early 20s, like you're on the hunt for a mate, and it's it's very easy to kind of leverage your position in martial arts to woo a female, for lack of a better word. And that happened a lot. Men were dating their colleagues or even their students, people they were teaching. Men were recruiting their girlfriends to come and train in the dojo, which I always saw as like a weird way for them to kind of like secure their power position over them, which is, hey, come train in the dojo and then you could just bow to me forever because I'll always be your. I saw a dude. There was this whole family that trained, family of just a couple brothers, and the senior student was the oldest brother, and he recruited his mother to be his student. And I remember I relayed this in the book. She was training under him, and I saw her and him interact at a seminar. And he, she called him by his first name, and and then she stopped herself and she said, "Oh, I mean sensei." And I was like, "Come on!" I was like, "I don't care who you are. Your mom should not be calling you sensei." But it was, again, it was this weird undercurrent of dominance that exists in martial arts, and then it led to more nefarious things, which is you know uh, high ranking students actually sleeping with junior students, clearly junior students, either in their school or in the other school, in which it became a little bit more nebulous because it's like, okay, I'm sleeping with this student in this other school, but she's not my student. She's just a junior student in the next town over or whatever. And and then it got really messy because um, for a fact, there was times where it was not consensual, or it was reported that it wasn't consensual, or there was alcohol involved. So then, you cannot consent when you're intoxicated. So then it's like, this is really different people have different opinions on that. I mean, I personally would consider that sexual assault, and I think that's reasonable to do. But regardless, it shouldn't even matter because it's inappropriate. It's very,
Well,
very inappropriate.
exactly. And this is top down. This kind of thing, the thing we're talking about right now, comes directly from the leadership
Right.
from the sensei, right? Because it is 100% within his scope of power, and even it's appropriate that he lay down rules, or he or she lay down rules of conduct, ethical guidelines, or things to follow. If you're going to be so intrusive as to create a religious philosophy or a spiritual philosophy of some kind, and you're going to, convince people that this is the way that they should train, you're going into their headspace. You're not just training them in physical techniques. And so if you're going to go there, then you're going to have to start addressing the ethics of the philosophy. Any philosophical system is going to have some kind of ethical component. And clearly that was either not there or only given lip service. I'm kind of curious, was there any ethical component to this whole system of animals and numbers and triangles and stuff?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I phrase it as we were a values based system,
Mm-hmm.
or organization, which is why when some women came forward, and they actually pointed the finger at one instructor in particular, and he was pretty much the highest ranking guy. He wasn't technically at that point, but the highest ranking guy left in protest, which then made him the highest ranking guy. And I call him the bad actor in my
I,
book.
okay, I was wondering if this was the guy we were talking about. Yeah.
Yeah, this is the bad actor. And again, it gets the circumstances were nebulous because more than one woman came forward. But there were some women that said, okay, this was overt sexual assault. There were other women that said, well, it was consensual, but we were both under the influence of alcohol. And then it's like, well, I think legally, in depending on states and stuff, I'm not an expert, but if you are intoxicated, you cannot give consent. Um,
I
but
don't know that that's a legal point at this point, but it certainly is contested. It's certainly something worth
right.
talking about. It's certainly a subject worth discussing.
But then there were some women that said, well, we were intoxicated, but it was consensual.
Mm-hmm.
But then when I discussed this with people and eventually with Concho, I said, to what degree can you even give consent when this is the highest ranking person in the organization and you're not? I mean, that's a clear
Exactly.
conflict. Like, you have every incentive to not, stir the boat, because some of these women, when they brought this forward, like, they were asked to leave the organization and they weren't actually expelled, or I don't know for sure, but I know in some cases it was like, hey, I think it'd be best if you leave.
Oh,
like
wow.
just for your sake. I'm not saying that you have to leave. I'm just saying, it was that kind of stuff.
That's
Um,
how it was dealt with?
yeah, I mean, he just, so what I didn't like, is that I feel like Concho, he looked at everything in the realm of the law and legal, litigation, things like that. And so he was always kind of making the point like, hey, these are two consenting adults. They're over 18. It didn't happen at a Seibukan, it didn't happen in the dojo or at a Seibukan event or something like that, although some of them did happen at Seibukan events. Although it's not clear, were they sponsored by Sabucon or were they just, we always hung out together, so everything was a Sabucon event. But to me, none of those things really mattered, because I was like, well, first of all, we're not talking about what's legal, we're talking about what's permissible in your organization.
Right.
And you are a values-based organization. Okay, like this isn't fucking Walmart. At Walmart, you can sleep with whoever you want. Like it's not a values-based organization. And actually, even in Walmart, it's in any other organization, it's a general rule like, hey, do not sleep with employees or people that you have a degree of power over. So the person that was being accused of these things, the bad actor, this was a family man, married, children. So I was like, who cares about the law? Like, let's just call this what it is. Like, this is someone that is absolutely breaking the values that our organization is purported to be based on, and he's got to go. Like, that seems like a no-brainer to me. But the problem was, this person ran a very successful school, that I'm sure was generating a degree of income, probably a great degree of income. I don't know for sure. But more importantly than that, I mean, he was sort of propped up as like the golden boy. And if you were to admit that perhaps, basically you couldn't kick him out, because that would be admitting that you had been deceived for quite some time, because it had been happening for quite some time. So Concho made a choice. I think he made the wrong choice, and I told him as much. And a lot of people left, and unfortunately I could not leave because I had already left at that point. And I felt very guilty about that, because some people left in very public ways, and they wrote letters, and it was very kind of dramatic. And I never had the opportunity to do that. And in some ways, maybe that was the genesis of the idea of the book, was I felt powerless, and I was finding out, more things from more people. And I was just like, he's going to get away with all this. He's gonna move to Japan and open his next school, and this story will never be told. And I never, I don't want people to go to jail or anything like that. But the story should be told.
Well, for sure. And if there are crimes being committed, then we want law enforcement looking into that kind of thing.
Sure. Yeah.
Absolutely we do. I want to be clear. I mean, we're in a time of transition right now, Me Too, and, the ongoing activities of feminism and equal rights and civil rights, and the battles that are being fought across the social spectrum on all of this. Is basically, and they talk about this in the left probably too much, but you can tend to go a little bit nuts on this concept, but it is true that power dynamics matter greatly. And when you're in a structured, formal situation like a school, like a workplace, like a government, where the structure of the system itself depends on the lines of authority between senior and junior members, and that these relationships be, they're carefully defined relationships. There's a student, there's a master, right? There's teachers, there's these various intermediate levels. There's just never been in our entire history as a species a time when you can introduce sex into that situation and have it come out well.
Right.
It just never works. And this has been a bugbear for leadership for centuries. How do you deal with this? Because people get together and they start getting randy, and then things start happening. And if you don't put some rules in place, and you can go too extreme on this too. But at the same time, you have to question the motives of somebody who's not putting any control in on this, or who's trying actively to cover it up. You mentioned kicking people out of the school, or keeping it quiet, or, we're not going to enforce We're not going to go with law enforcement on this, even though it's literally a criminal act.
Right.
You know, where you have very clear-cut situations like that, this is where the Catholic Church has fallen down over and over and over and over again. And it seems to be a point where almost every one of these destructive cults falls down on this
Yeah,
area of it.
it always ends with sex like that. I feel
Yep.
like that should be on the chart of the circle of life for cults, which is that is the last step in dominance, you know. And
That's right.
when you are, especially when you're at the head of the organization, and it just seems inevitable that eventually you would have to start sleeping with students and exerting that final measure of control. You know, martial arts is so interesting because it right off the bat it is structured, you know, like a cult starter kit. To the fact, you know, if you when you walk into, I'm presuming an office of Scientology on the first day, you know, they're going to go out of their way to seem not culty, right?
Oh,
Like
way out of their way. Oh, yeah.
yeah, they're going to
Oh, yeah.
seem as normal as possible. But when you walk into a martial arts studio, uh, it's the opposite, which is they're like, here's your uniform. We all wear the same thing. You need to call this person senpai or sensei, but you need to call this person Kiyoshi Rensi. You should bow to him. You know, you need to bow to this statue at the front, and you need to clap your hands twice at the beginning of class and clap them again at the end. And so much of that stuff would be completely unacceptable in if you went to Gold's Gym, you know. But in martial arts, we've romanticized it because of film and television, and we're very charmed by that kind of stuff. And in a normal cult, you know, you would have to go very carefully conceal those aspects if they existed for quite some time. But in martial arts, it's actually a selling point, which is like, oh wow, look at how, you know, and they cloak it under tradition, under you know, words like tradition and etiquette and things like that. But as I learned history, I learned that you know, martial arts in Japan prior to probably like judo, they were all very intertwined with religious Shintoism and sort of family hierarchies. They were all primarily family based martial arts. So you know, a lot of the stuff that you do in Japanese martial arts, Aikido is a fantastic example. You know, the founder of Aikido, Ueshiba, or they call him O Sensei, you know, he was part of sort of an obscure mystic Japanese religion, which was very much sort of based on that Buddhist Shintoism. He was a priest in that religion. I could be wrong on that part, but if he wasn't a priest, I mean, he was pretty active in that. And you see, he inserted that into the etiquette and the sort of the rituals that you saw in Aikido. So that if you're doing Aikido, you know, I'm not saying that you're practicing a religion, but you're definitely going through some motions that you might not be aware of what their origins are. And it's funny, I was talking with a friend of mine, and he said, yeah, I got these students that came in, and they were like Amish or something. They were part of some strict religion. And they said, hey, we want to train here, but we're not comfortable bowing or calling, you know, people sensei or things like that. And this instructor didn't know what to do. And he said, well, that's kind of like what you have to do here. And I said, well, I get it, because I mean, like bowing to someone like that does come from Buddhism. That's why we don't bow to people in the West for the most part. I said, so, you know, you kind of are practicing a religion when you're doing some of these old martial arts, if you see it that way. Most people don't. So I don't want to, but like in, you know, Concho, we found out years later, he was a priest in some obscure Japanese religion. I think it was called the Mikyo branch of Buddhism. And, you know, a lot of the stuff that we did in the beginning and end of class, the phrases that we used, a lot of that was actually reflections of Mikyo, which was a very weird mystic, you know, religion where they worshipped kind of a warrior god. You know, Concho at some point, he started pushing this narrative that he was a reincarnated samurai. You know, all sorts of stuff that you look back and you're like, yeah, maybe we were like being more religious than we realized, you know?
Well, you're not far off on that, and you're not alone in it either, because every single adherent of TM is following a religious ritual.
Mm.
right? Every single person who's doing transcendental meditation, and most of them are clueless about it. Most, especially Westerners, right? They get involved in this. They get their meditation word, and they have this whole little ritual that they do, and they have no idea that that ritual that they're doing is actually a religious ritual to acknowledge the divinity of the deity that they are actually worshiping in the Hindu religion or faith, if I'm remembering that right. And that's TM, which a ton of Westerners swear by and think has nothing to do with religion. Has everything to do with religion.
Right.
Exactly the way you're talking about, right? So there's a matter of etymology or sourcing, right? Things can go back to a religious source without necessarily having to be religious now, and maybe some people might see it that way. But it's a very good point to make, because if you don't know what you're doing, it doesn't mean that you're not doing it. You are still doing it. You're practicing your religion, even if you don't know you are. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and it's weird. It's, because you haven't assigned a value to it. Are you practicing a religion unconsciously? I don't know. That's sort of a deep question, but I guess a larger point is that if you're practicing a religion totally unconsciously and without assigning a value, it's very easy for then someone to come in and power that up. And
well, that's what I mean. That's what I
right.
mean. As I'm not trying to be mystical here or tell people they're doing something they're not doing. I mean that you can use this to advantage.
Yeah, absolutely.
And
yeah.
Boy, that's a deep subject, actually, going down that little rabbit hole. But I think we'll pull back on that one, because there's a lot of there could be a lot of controversy on that too. But let's talk about a couple of the mechanisms of the group you were involved in terms of cult mechanisms, because they did exist, and you do describe them in your book, right? For example, we've talked about here, to a degree, we've sort of had it in the background a little bit, the financial aspect of this.
Yes.
We talked about it with the Uchu, with the student guys. Right? Yeah. I'm horrible at this language stuff. So, but we talked about it with that. But then we also have this other thing, the belt machine, which you pointed out to me, and I did read up on that in your book, and I was fascinated by it, because it's a system that is just begging for abuse, and of course that's exactly what happened. So you want to describe that whole belt machine process? Because I think that speaks a bit to, they're saying you're doing something, and then there's what you're really doing.
Right.
And I think this is a good example of showing the difference between those two things with your group.
Yeah. So to lay the table for maybe people that don't understand, in a traditional martial arts economic model, you are monetizing attendance, just like a gym. You pay a fee, and as long as you're up on your payments, you're allowed to use the facilities and go to unlimited classes or 3 classes a week or something like that. In Seibukan, we did monetize attendance, but we kept our fees reasonable. I think it was $85 a month, which was, even at that time, like $150 is more what the standard is now. But in addition to that, we monetize progression in the system. And that is something that in most schools, when you are promoted one rank to another, you're typically not charged a fee, or you're charged a very modest fee to cover the cost of the physical belt that he had to buy in bulk, your instructor, or she had to buy in bulk. So in Seibukan, we monetize progression. Every belt costs money, and it costs progressively more money. The fees have changed over the years. My very first belt, which was white to yellow, was $35. Anyone can pay that. But then my first black belt, which I received 9 months after I started training, which I'll circle back to that, was, I think, probably $250. And then everyone went up incrementally. When I got my 7th degree black belt, I think it was $700 or $800. And then after that, when we created more belts, we were bumping up against $1,000. And I know that was money we didn't have. I mean, like I said, we were primarily young people, and even the Uchideshi had to pay, I believe, those belt fees or some version of it on top of their huge fees they were already paying. And because we tied in progression with sort of your personal growth and enlightenment. And because our belt promotion ceremonies were such euphoric events, we were highly motivated to get promoted. So it created a conflict, which is that you want to have quality control over your students. If someone's going to get a black belt, you would like to think they have some sort of degree of skill that is matching with what you think a black belt should be. But at the same time, if someone says, well, how long does it take to get a black belt? Well, we want everyone to wait at least a year, because we think that that's how long it takes to acquire those kinds of skills. And that's what we did. It was at least a year. And a year in almost any other organization is absurdly short.
That's what I thought. I thought that sounded crazy to me, a year for a black belt. Yeah.
So we would say, you have to wait 1 year. Okay. And then after that, you should wait another year and another year. So 1 year between each. But then maybe someone comes along and says, well, gee, I'd really like to get it sooner. I could pay you $700. Say, well, I guess you could do some private lessons. Or, we have this supercharged program called the Uchideshi program. Maybe you could do that. Uchideshi, they could get their black belt in half the time, so they could do it in 6 months.
Man.
So they pay the fees, and then they.
This is so Scientology, man.
Right.
Oh my God! Especially because every level is progressively more and more money too, more social status.
Exactly, the social status was really big.
Yep.
And at a certain point, you could start teaching yourself, teaching classes, teaching private lessons, which you could make some money from, but it was a very small amount compared to, how much you had to give a concho. You could start teaching seminars, open your own school, things like that. Take an instructor course, which was pretty expensive, so that you could become a certified instructor. And the absolute maddest it got was at one point we did sort of an experiment, and we got a group of 7 students, or maybe it was 5, and we promoted them from 0 martial arts training to black belt in 21 days.
That was the Dragon Island thing?
That was the Dragon Island, which was this whole crazy idea for this reality show that we had. It was just the height of our delusion. And, we thought we were going to film this reality show and pitch it to television networks. And it was just an unmitigated disaster. And as far as like the logistics of it, we were so unorganized, and the people running it were just not the right people. And we totally drugged those 5 people across the finish line. I mean, it was the physical version of cramming for a test. Like, they could do the motions, but they could not improvise. They didn't really know what to do if things didn't go according to plan. And if anything, it was an experiment that proved that it was not possible to promote someone that fast. And almost all of them quit. I don't think any of them kept training. Maybe 1 or 2 kept for maybe another year, but they all quit. So then you have this mechanism that you're promoting students very fast. Because students being promoted generates income, it makes it a little harder to instill really good quality control, because you're literally, people are trying to give you money, and it's hard to say no to that. So that was one problem, is that we were progressing really rapidly through ranks. I got my first black belt in 9 months, which was like an exception made for me, because I did take private lessons every month, which I paid for each private lesson, in addition to my monthly fees, in addition to the black belt fee. And then after that, I got 1 black belt every year for 7 years, until I was the highest ranking that could happen. And
7th degree black belt in
7th degree black belt.
Okay.
And then I got 2 other black belts in different martial arts that Concho also taught. So I thought I was cross training, but I kind of wasn't, because I was just trained under him anyways. So if you think about it, originally when Concho designed the belt system, he kind of thought, okay, it should take you a long time to go from new student to 7th degree black belt. And maybe I want to go faster than other traditional martial arts, but like, it still should take, 10 years is a reasonable time. But when an Uchideshi came in there, and remember, Uchideshi was supposed to only be 1 year, but what happened was people started being Uchideshi for like 3-4 years. So in a 3-4 year period, they're eligible to get promoted every 6 months, which means in like 4.5 years, they had burned through the entire system. There was no more belts for them to get.
Right.
And at a certain point, when we really hit the gas and we had a lot of students, we had a lot of uchideshi, suddenly you're looking around and you were surrounded by really, really high ranking black belts. And we ran out of runway, which is that we were promoting students faster than we could acquire new ones. And then if you think about it, you know, me as a student, if you monetize me, I'm paying you fees at scheduled increments. Every year I get a black belt, and that's a guaranteed, you know, $200 to $700 in your bank. But after I become a seventh Dan, my value has dropped to zero. I'm not going to get promoted anymore, so I'm kind of financially worthless. And then you have to find something else for me to do, because that was what was happening with all of us. We were all becoming seventh Dans, and really, in theory, there should only ever be like a fairly small number of seventh Dans. It should be like a pyramid, you know. But the pyramid was like flipped upside down, where actually there were very few like white and yellow belts, and there were a ton of seventh, sixth, and fifth Dans. And so we had to, that was the belt machine, which was the students were actually, I think, surprising Concho with how ravenous they were about training. You know, I don't think Concho ever anticipated that people would be Uchideshi for so long. And I think in some level he realized it wasn't good. But again, hey, you want to pay me $500 a month for another year? Yeah, let's renew the contract. So then we started trying to come up with ways to continue to monetize students, which, you know, we would make them do we would invite them to do the instructor course, even though we had no classes for them to teach at the headquarters. So, you know, in the beginning, it was like, okay, one guy teaches 3 days a week, the other guy teaches 3 days a week or 2 days a week. But then it became like, okay, like you teach every other Wednesday, once a month, because, you know, all the slots are taken by different people. Again, like these people weren't skilled enough to go open their own businesses per se. So we're trying to herd them through the instructor curriculum, even though there's really nowhere for them to teach. We're trying to get them to continue to be Uchideshi. And then we actually just created new belt levels. We created 8th, 9th, and 10th Dan. And those belt levels were technically always there. I remember when I first started, it's like, well, we have 8th, 9th, and 10th Dans, but no one's ever attained them yet, because the system was still in its middle ages at that point. And the theory was like, those belt levels are only for students that own their schools and have X number of students. But I think eventually Concho, he was like the guy like trying to hold the door shut, you know, and they're just banging on the other side. And eventually he was like, all right, you can be an 8th Dan, you can be a 9th Dan. So we had people that didn't own schools being 8th, 9th, and 10th Dans. And it just swallowed us up, because when you're in a mindset of progression, which we programmed our students to always be going for the next belt level. It was not a passive thing at all. Like the day you show up in Sabacon, someone gives you a paper that says, here's your promotion requirements. And then like literally it was a tradition, like the day you get promoted, even to black belt or second degree black belt or whatever, someone gives you your requirements for the next level before you leave.
Right.
So
the whole culture was a progress culture.
yeah.
You must be continuing to move, or there's actually kind of something wrong with you.
Yeah, and of course, you know, we were really good at doublespeak. So we would say the exact opposite. We'd say, "Oh, the belt doesn't matter. It's not about the belt at all." You know, but really, you know, if you look at our actions, like you said, the belt was the only thing that mattered. And it got to a point where, you know, if for 4 years or 5 years you've had a progression of it's always about the next thing, and then suddenly there's nothing else, like people didn't know what to do. And you had people, we called it the Nanadan blues. Nanadan is the Japanese word for 7th degree black belt. So the Nanadan blues was like this depression that set in, which is, I don't matter. And it felt like, I don't know if this was real or perceived, but it felt like Concho would kind of stop paying attention to you, because there was just nothing left for you to do. And he's going to turn his attention to the young up and comers that, you know, there's thousands and thousands of dollars that they can contribute. And I don't know if he if he looked at, I'm not saying that he looked at everyone as a dollar sign. But I am saying that, you know, Concho, whether he wanted to or not, like he could not put the brakes on, because at that point, you know, he had 2 kids. He had a nice house in the Seaside Highlands. He drove a Mercedes. He went to Japan 2-3 times a year. His wife was from Japan, expensive trips. And it's like, this was his source of income. Like he couldn't turn the hose off. You know, he had bills to pay just like everyone else.
I don't imagine that this was a whole lot different than L. Ron Hubbard. And I would like to tell you now, and the audience as well, an analogy as to how David Miscavige in Scientology solved the exact same problem you ran into in your school. And I'll use the terms of your school to describe what David Miscavige did with Scientology. Imagine your bad actor guy took over the school, right? And Concho disappears or goes off or whatever or dies. That's Scientology, right? The bad actor took over. And it's not like the first guy was that great, but the second guy is even worse, in different ways. But they're both equally as horrible, but just in different ways. So the bad actor then tells all the students, okay, we've got this highest level and all of this. Well, here's what the real deal is. I'm actually sending all you guys back down to your blue belts or your white belts, because you didn't actually get it. You only thought you did.
Whoa.
And I'm actually going to charge you to go back up the levels again, because you didn't get it right, as Concho actually intended for you to get it. Right? This is the problem, right? Is you've attained this level, but you are not only out of stuff to do, which is the exact problem David Miscavige ran into with Scientologists, because there's only so much levels of the bridge that Scientologists can do, and they get to OT8, and you want to talk about the blues, man. It is noteworthy how many people who get to the highest level, OT8 or OT7 in Scientology, commit suicide. Wow. Or get cancer. It's weird. It's been noted.
They get cancer?
They're old. I mean, I don't know that the cancer thing is statistically significant.
Right.
But the suicides are. And I wouldn't be surprised if there was a statistically greater amount of cancer patients also, because there is, or there can be, with some of these. And again, don't misinterpret me. Don't think I'm talking in black and white terms right now. That, you know, everything is context specific, but there are psychosomatic factors that can contribute to a cancer, to certain kinds of cancer or cancer conditions.
Yeah, I think that's pretty well.
Yeah, like I'm talking about stress. I'm talking about depression. I'm talking about like your body responds to your mental states, because your mental states are actually, in the end of the day, physiological states too. Yeah. So it all goes together, you know, is all I'm really sort of asserting there. And you're absolutely right. There are studies that back this up.
Yeah.
So that was how David Miscavige solved that problem. And I thought it might be interesting to put it in those terms of how your school works, because as you were describing all that, I was thinking, you know, as crazy as that system is that he set up with the belt machine, and as good as you did seeing what that was and how that was a point of downfall for the organization, because he created his own monster, and he probably did it. It was probably an unintended consequence, like you said.
I think it totally was.
Yeah, and he just found himself trapped by his own system, because what's the one thing a cult leader cannot admit to? That he was wrong. Cannot do it, right? And you set up a student-master situation, and it even more reinforces that. Because we have these crazy expectations that masters or senseis or teachers can ever be wrong. And it's the most stupid, arbitrary idea that we've ever come across as human beings, but we all run it on our teachers.
Yeah, and that's something I do write some words in the book. Sort of, I felt, I don't know if pity is the correct word. Empathy is a word maybe I like more, or sympathy. Empathy means you have experienced it. Sympathy means you haven't experienced it, but you can understand. Anyways, I felt sympathy because over the years, I saw Concho go from a well-respected man to like a deity or some sort of pseudo deity. And a lot of that came with the out-of-towners. because, you know, they were traveling. They'd only interacted with Concho through stories of their instructor, who of course wants to make it seem like he trained under the most amazing guy possible.
Right.
So that's when it really started to happen. And over the years, I feel like I saw a toll that it took on him as a man, which was that he always had to be on, and people were looking to him to solve their problems, to say something deep, and you know, something that they would tell their other students or their kids about. And that was something that I felt like he, in some ways, he kind of dreaded. I remember one night, like, he went to the movies with us, and we saw some stupid movie in the thing, and I remember, like, he was just like so excited. um and I think it was just like, oh man, I can go just to be a person, you know. And even then he couldn't really, because we adored him, you know. But that is the element that we as the students create, which was, we forced greatness on him whether he wanted it or not. And I'm not saying he didn't step up to the plate, because he absolutely did. But at the same time, like, there was a part of us that we craved this, you know, the father that we never had, kind of a thing. We always joke that there was a lot of students at the top that coincidentally didn't seem to have relationships with their own fathers. um, and so we always joked about daddy issues and all that stuff. But um, you know, I mean, I think there was this one guy that he was crying at his promotion, and he's like, he said, Concho, I feel like you're the father, you know, you've been like a father figure to me. And the guy that said that, his dad was in the audience. It's
Oh,
like,
burn. Oh,
like, geez,
oh.
what a burn.
Yeah, totally, man. Oh, okay. Well, moving right along.
So
Um,
that's the codependency, you know,
yeah,
like,
well, exactly. I'm so
yeah,
glad you brought that up. It's. I was gonna, because I was gonna make that point, and I'm so glad you did. It's a vitally important point that, you know, we look at the cult leaders as the nefarious bad guys, and often they are. Okay, I'm not giving anybody a pass here. You take
sure.
advantage of people, you get what you deserve. But um, but it is a codependent relationship. There is zero question about that. In every single one of these groups I've looked at, over all the years I've looked at it, and all of the professionals I've talked to about this, psychologists, you know, psychiatrists, sociologists, cult experts, every one of them agrees. The followers are putting as much into this stuff as the leader is, because it has to work that way. You can't be a flyby cult follower. You can't be a casual, passive cult follower. It doesn't work that way.
Right.
You know, you have to go all in, and that's the nature of the beast. You know, and when you do, well, then there are unintended consequences to that, and you didn't see it coming. It's not necessarily your fault, but at the same time, you are the one who did it.
I remember when we had our 21st birthday celebration, which was obviously, with the numbers, that was a big deal to us. And that was, if there's as close to a moment of clarity, that was it. Um, and it was this big, we rented a hotel, or the conference center in the hotel, and we had big all day training. And then the evening we had a dinner. We all got dressed up. There was literally a red carpet, and the background with the Sabucon logos, like movie stars do. We took pictures. There was a professional photographer, or we borrowed some student that had a nice camera. Uh, and because we were a little cheap, like, it was always, we were always
Yeah.
like bumming. Like, all the construction work in the dojo was done by students, you know, basically unpaid. There's like no insurance on the building, which I think is like illegal or something, as far as I know.
Uh
Um,
huh. Yeah, it is.
and what was weird about that night was, you know, Concho came in the room. He had a white tuxedo on with the tails on it, and white shoes, the whole thing. I mean, it was his moment. He was very happy. You know, he'd been talking about the 21st birthday for a long time.
Right.
And and then we all were like giving speeches, and it was just these it was such a weird moment, Chris. It was like we were all taking turns giving these long, elaborate professions of faith and loyalty, and it was total virtue signaling, and everyone had to be bigger than the last. People were crying. And what made that, in some ways it was normal, we did stuff like that a lot, but what made it real to me was all of our, like, spouses and significant others were there, girlfriends, boyfriends, and they were freaked the fuck out. And I remember looking at Sarah, my wife, and she was just like, and it suddenly clicked for me. I was like, this is really uncomfortable for them. Like they recognize this is not normal, like these professions of faith that we're doing. And and I left, like, oh, and I went to the bar to get a drink. I was like, I need a drink. and, and I was listening to these bartenders, and they didn't, you know, I was like coming up and I could kind of overhear them. And they're just like, so it's a cult? And the guy was like, no, I think they do like martial arts. And the guy was like, oh no, like my cousin's in a cult and this is a cult.
Yep.
And then you know, I came up and they're just like polishing those
Yep,
glasses.
yep,
And I order a drink and they're just like, they're giving me the drink like they give a hostage, you know, something. They're just like, here's your drink, please go away, don't talk to me about your weird cult thing.
Right.
And then it kind of hit me. I was like, oh wow, like this is how normal people react to what we've become. And another thing that was really weird about that night was, you talked about the mechanisms of control. One of our other mechanisms was like this really long complex jargon that we had developed, and we had this sort of coded language to the point where it actually was starting to work against us. Like it was hard to have normal conversations because we had been kind of programmed to insert all these buzzwords. I talked about the 21 concepts. Well, those were 21 words that we just had to insert in everything, and the awareness assessment action, all that. So like it was very Orwellian in the sense that, you know, in like 1984, Orwell makes the point that in order to control the population, they actually limit their vocabulary so that they cannot form. It's hard for them to put words to their thoughts because they don't have the words to do it. And in some ways, I felt like that was kind of what happened to us. I remember the last time I talked to Concho, he was just like a raving madman, you know, like he, and I told him, I was like, I was like, can you not talk like that for like 2 seconds? Because I don't even know what you're saying. Literally, you're just stringing together buzzwords through sentences, and I can't understand you. And by that point, I'd been away from SaberCon for a year or so. So I was just like, it was coming back. I was like, wow, is this what I sounded like? You know?
Loaded language, man. It is probably one of the most crucial control elements of a group. You know, it's a way we use it's loaded language language is important because we need specialized words to describe specialized concepts. So every single subspecialized group ends up with their own language. But what I'm curious about, and I think you've described it pretty well, but let me ask you this: um, in addition to what you just said, is there anything more about how that language was used in your group to create an us versus them mentality?
Yeah. In fact, I think we even had sort of words for us versus them. Like we joked about normies, like normal
Yes.
people.
Yes.
So I talked about this house that we got, and it was a large apartment upstairs. We called it the Uchi house because all the Uchideshi could live there. Although other people started living there because eventually there wasn't enough people to pay rent, and when stuff started collapsing. But um, what we would have these huge parties there, raging parties. I mean, you know, just like a college party basically. And it would always be when the out of towners came because we train all day and then at night we'd go celebrate. And in a weird way, like some of my favorite memories are of those times because they were really fun. But one thing that happened was I would try to bring Sarah there. And at that time, we weren't married, we were dating. Um, and she would go and I would sort of drag her there, and she knew, you know, all the people in Sabucon. But what she told me one time, she's like, I just can't go to those things. I was like, what do you mean? It's great. So and so's there and stuff. And she's like, she said, I don't know what you guys are talking about. Like, and I'm not saying, you know, I don't understand that. I'm saying literally, like you're using sort of vocabulary and phrases that you understand what they mean. I don't understand what they mean. And then two, like we just had to talk about martial arts. That was sort of our commonality. And I remember talking to one of my best friends who was also married, and he said, oh yeah, my wife can't come either. You know, it's too much for her. We end up doing martial arts on the floor. uh, so as far as the jargon, you know, a lot of it was we would say things to each other that had a sort of coded meaning or a coded language. Some of that was just we spoke a lot of Japanese. Um, and it was actually just more like Japanese vocabulary. We didn't, none of us really understood Japanese language. I think we thought we did, because everyone wants to pretend they know another language. So so part of that was we would just say the Japanese to each other, and then some of that extended to the titles. All the titles were in Japanese, so you call someone senpai or renshi in the dojo, and then it just becomes kind of fun to call them that outside the dojo. But then it gets taken too far, and I'm in CVS trying to get a bottle of wine for something unrelated, and I see a student or two there, and they're like bowing to me. Oh, good evening, renshi. And it's like, it's fucking CVS, and there's people looking, at us like, what's going on over there? And that's when it became like a little bit harder to deal with the outside world. And then the Dragon Island thing was a big part of that too, which was, we filmed Dragon Island, supposed to be this whole reality show, and we started marketing it on social media. We made a trailer, and our goal was to like get enough attention where maybe we could reshoot it a second time, and this was like a proof of concept, and maybe we could talk to a network or something about it. But when we went on Facebook, we thought it was really cool and people were going to be blown away, but the reaction was just overwhelmingly negative, and I think it shocked some of us, and it made us retreat into our bubble, and we started feeling like, oh, we can't share what we do. We have to be careful when we share what we do with the outside world. And then our recruitment sort of changed, where it was like, we're not just looking for students, like we're looking for the right kind of people.
Right. There it is.
Yeah.
There it is. That's right. Both of those last two things you said are the cherry on top of it, because that's when it is truly us versus them.
Right.
Not just us and them.
Mm.
Right? And us versus them is the crucial part, and that enters in exactly where you just said. That was I could not have conceived of a better answer, because it was exactly the progression. You're doing this group, you're totally into it, it's totally amazing, everybody loves it, this is the best thing since sliced bread. You show it to the outside world and they all go, you guys are out of your minds. That's right. Crazy talk. What are you talking about? Black belts in 6 months. Get out of here.
Yeah.
And your response is not, holy cow, you're right. What am I involved in? That's hardly anybody's response. Most people are going to double down.
In a weird way, like, we knew who the right kind of person was. And it was the Eric Hoffer true believer, which was, okay, like, and we never explicitly said this, but there was this unsaid thing that, okay, we're looking for someone young, early 20s, maybe they have a job, maybe they're just kind of working part-time, a little bit lost, looking for, maybe not as many friends as they would like. And someone might come in the dojo and they wouldn't fit the profile. And we wouldn't run them out of there, but like, we just knew, we're like, you're not the right person.
That's right. That's right. That's exactly
you're married with kids and you're a lawyer. Yeah, I don't know. You seem, like you got a lot of stuff going on. Maybe this isn't.
Yeah, at first, maybe it might not even be fully conscious at first, but it's just this pushback against not us. You're not us. We don't want you here.
And to be fair, we even do that in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu sometimes, like.
Oh, every group does. It's just a matter of degree.
Profiling is human nature.
That's right. That's right. We're going to categorize no matter what.
Yes. Yeah.
But the exclusionary categorizing and the pushback and the resistance to other thinking, and this is where the echo chamber starts being created. This is where the bubble world starts being created. It's all part of the picture. So I'm glad we could highlight that pit. I'm curious, as a example of this, did anybody ever come to your school who had been formally trained to a black belt degree or to a high degree in another school, and then came in and said, hey, what do you guys got to teach me? And what happened with them?
Yeah, so we did not like those people.
Surprise.
And again, like, we were masters of double speak. So we would say the exact opposite. We'd say, oh, this is great. And we would kind of flatter them. Oh, your experience is going to be so useful for helping you learn Seibukan. But, really, in a very subtle way, from day one, it was just like, cool. So everything is wrong.
Yep.
And we had some, it was a big problem, honestly, because especially if you came from a school where you did resist during training, we could not handle that. And there were a couple times where someone would come from another school and they'd be training and maybe things got a little heated, and suddenly they would flip a switch and they'd whoop our instructor's ass. And it was like, get this under control right away. It's that this cannot happen. And then you got to take them aside and be like, oh, we actually do no challenge, no resistance, no injury here, because if that instructor wanted to, he could have fucking killed you. So if you're
Right.
lucky, go up. But really, he was holding back a lot in that moment where you threw him through, halfway across the mat, because or you'd get kids that, we had a guy come and he wrestled in college, and Division II wrestler or something like that. And if you ever train with a wrestler, those guys, they are 100% resisting, and they are programmed. You can't make them be passive if you want. I mean, it's a part of their training. They're very difficult to deal with, even now as a jiu-jitsu specialist. And that would be an example of a guy that as soon as he came in, he's like, yeah, I wrestled in high school, I wrestled in college, I was really good. We would basically be like, we can't let this guy train here, because and we had this subtle process of kind of excluding them and driving them out, because they would just make us look bad, because they knew what was up.
Exactly. I did it ever occur to you at the time, harkening back to when you were talking about those exact guys in there making, and you were pushing back against them? Do you see it now, or was it conscious then?
It was conscious then,
Okay.
because just for me personally, like, my ego felt threatened by them. uh and I was, a dirty little secret is, until I started studying Gracie Jiu-Jitsu later, when I was like a fifth degree black belt. But up until that time, I never ever felt confident in my skills and ability to defend myself, ever.
Wow.
And what would happen is, and I just knew that in my mind. And in some ways, I was kind of open with it, because that's why I went and cross trained.
Mm-hmm.
I remember situations just like I just described. Someone came in the dojo and gave me a little bit of resistance or pushback, and I felt like something was wrong. And um, and all those things were planting seeds of doubt right away. And I remember I went and trained with a buddy that he had left. He'd gone to Los Angeles. He started doing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. He did it for like 6 months, and we used to train together. So he came back into town, and I was like, "Hey, let's go to this place." It's like a grassy lawn or something, and we laid some mats down, and we started training. And we used to train in like very kind of controlled, rehearsed ways, but he had sort of changed his methodology, and he just tackled me to the ground and held me down, and there was just nothing I could do. And I was just and we did it like 3 times over 45 minutes, and it was just the same result. I mean, it wasn't a fluke in my mind. I couldn't explain it away. I was like, "Well, we tried it multiple times. Like, I tried different things. I just had nothing." And yeah, I remember driving home being like, "Oh shit." Like, I'm at that point, I was like a third, fourth degree black belt. I was like, that shouldn't have happened, right? And then I went and talked to my teachers, and they said exactly what you said. They said, "Oh, well, you just, did you, maybe you weren't using your center enough." They said very vague, kind of generic things that I'd be like, "Yeah, you're right. Maybe I didn't use my center."
Right. There you
Like,
go. See that, and there's another. I love this. This is another great example of how the language, right? Thought stopping cliche. Okay, good.
right.
That explains it enough that the cognitive dissonance has died down, and I can now continue.
Would you say a thought-stopping cliche?
Yes, a
I
thought.
like that.
Yes, a thought stopping
Yeah.
cliche. They are common. They are all over the place, and we use them all the time. and cults specialize in their use. And if you can, these thought-stopping mechanisms, these labels that get used, they just shut down thinking.
And that was a big thing that kind of converted me into an enemy, which was I started cross training because, I knew, I was like, there's got to be something else. And I started cross training. I didn't tell Concho. He probably would not have been happy. He wouldn't have stopped me, but he wouldn't have been happy. And I started really getting into it to the point where I was becoming a true believer for a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu school, and that's where I stepped back and I was like, okay, like there's something about me and my experiences and my personality that like I'm drawn to, obsession. I have, obsession is like I don't want to say a character flaw, but yeah, it's like a character flaw that I have, and it's worked to my benefit in many times. I learned through obsession. So
well, you aren't alone in that, by the way, just so you know.
Yeah. Yeah, I know.
There's a lot of people who just go full immersion, and and again, nothing wrong with that. It's when you get taken advantage of that things go south,
Exactly. So when I did a lot of intensive training at the Gracie Jiu-Jitsu, so I had been trained by Concho. Hey, whoever you train with, you go to the top of the ladder. You train with the best guy in the world, which was good advice, actually. So I went to Torrance, California, and I trained under like the Gracie family, the branch of the family that created the UFC.
Yep.
And I would travel. I didn't go live there. I would drive from Monterey to Los Angeles. Talk about obsession, and I was private lessons. I mean, I was in it, and I became a true believer for their style of Gracie Jiu-Jitsu. Which was not as healthy, but I got over that later. And then I started coming back to Seibukan, and I started doing some of that shit. And right away, the tables turned, and it was like Louis, that guy now. Like he's the guy that is, not just resisting. I wasn't really resisting in training. I wasn't doing that. But what I would do is like there was times where, and this was my ego too, because I was there was part of me that I was resentful of the Uchideshi and that I had never been an Uchideshi. So I kind of had my own axe to grind there. But then I was like, oh, well, now I'm studying this martial art that none of them know, and it actually works way better. So I started, I just couldn't help myself. There was times where I'd be like, well, actually there might be a better way to do that. Here, let me show you what it is. And that got me in some trouble real quick. And then from then on, I just couldn't go back. It was like, Louis kind of an enemy now. Like he's not really, we still need to be nice to him. He's still a non-adon. And there were some people, the tricky thing was a lot of the students were genuinely curious about the skills I had learned, because they're like, oh, Louis, like he's got a whole new toolbox. He's pretty effective at some of this stuff now. So, then some people would be like, they'd want to learn more. And maybe after class, hey, show me that thing that you were talking about, or that thing that you did. But then I remember one day I was showing a guy something, some sort of Gracie Jiu-Jitsu move, and one of the actually was the bad actor. He saw me doing it, and it was his student I was teaching, and he freaked out. And from that day on, it was like I had the mark on me, man. And I just knew, I was like, it's time for me to go. I said, if I stay here, bad things are going to happen. Like, don't leave in anger. Like you obviously have some sort of resentment. I was becoming a man at that point. I had gotten married. I had a real job and a career with functional people around me to kind of see as a model, like, oh, there's really good, successful people that don't do Seibukan. And I was like, it's time. You need to start transitioning out, because you're going to keep getting better at Gracie Jiu-Jitsu. You're going to start training more in that. And you're not going to be able to help yourself. You're not going to be able to keep it under wraps. I just didn't have that self-control at that time. And I still don't. That's why I can't, even though part of me would love to go do some Aikido or something one of these days. It's like, once you become a meat eater, it's hard to go back,
Yes, exactly. It's funny you mentioned that, because I'll just share this real fast, and then I have a couple more questions for you. I tried to go learn Aikido here in Denver, and I went to a couple places, a couple studios to try. And I've got the background that I have, so I'm pretty familiar with. And I'm not saying that I walked in there and went, "Oh my God, this place is a cult." I'm not saying that. But what did happen was I went in and there was all the bowing and the scraping and the ritual and all of that, and I left because, well, at the time, what I looked at was I said, all this ritual seems to be more important to them than actually teaching the skill that I'm here to learn.
Right.
And I actually even wrote them about it. I said, look, you got all this, bowing and this and that and all this ritual. But when do I learn how to, stand or fall or this kind of thing? I mean, they sort of kind of got into this, but it was very, 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 very frustrating. And so I hit the eject button on that. And I'm kind of glad I did, because I think everything we've been talking about here is sort of where all that was going. Was that you said there was a series of seed planting or doubt creating over a period of time. What do you think, in hindsight, looking at your entire 7-year experience, right? Which I don't doubt. Many people have had of going in, going out, but I think we've described here that there was more going on than just got into a thing, got really gung ho about it, then got a little disaffected and then left. There's more to this than just you and your part in this. In hindsight now, is there anything you could offer as to what you could have seen or looked into at the beginning that might have been a red flag now that you know?
It's hard because I feel like I was so young. I just wasn't, I mean, of course there were a lot of warning signs about the money, being made to feel guilty or ostracized when you didn't take certain opportunities. Um, but at the same time, it's like I that's why they target younger people, because they're just not in a position to know that yet. Um, you know, Looking back, like one of the warning signs that I think about more now was that um, the purpose of all the training from the students was to then get the students to further serve the organization, as opposed to serve themselves and advance in their own lives. And I remember, you know, when people would tell, or when I would tell Concho, like, hey, I got hired. I graduated college, and I was like, I got a good job, And, there was this feeling of like, that's great. I hope it doesn't affect your training. I hope you can
Right.
still keep doing that. And it was like your success was kind of seen as maybe like a threat. Um, or my cross training was maybe seen as a threat. But honestly, like the people, I don't blame myself. I mean, for going through this, because I really was like, I was an idiot, like this is how people learn. Um, but there were other people that were older that were training, and we got much younger over time. But there was a period of time where there were a lot of older men that were mentors to me that were in the system. And I am a little harder on them. I'm like, how did how this worked on me? How did it work on you? Like you've been around the block. Um, but actually, a lot of the older men were kind of disaffected too. Uh, and there's people have been talking about this lately, that in the United States, there's sort of a crisis among older men that are maybe a little bit disaffected, and they have higher risks of suicide or gun violence or things like that. And maybe there was a little bit of that happening, that we were capturing that sort of profile of a man. But yeah, some of the older guys, I remember there was one older guy, his name was Paul. Probably shouldn't say his name, but there's a million Pauls.
Whatever, his name is Paul. Yeah. Oh, that one.
He told me one night we went and ate after, just me and him, and we were talking about stuff, and I said something about, oh, isn't Concho so great? And he said, hey, I love this place. He said, but I'm definitely not in the cult of Concho. And I never forgot that. And the way he just like he blew it off very casually. And I see him in hindsight as he was a guy that he could separate it, and he was able to train there for quite a while, but always sort of keep it at an arm's distance. He was very successful in his own life. He owned some sort of company or something like that. Ended up got married. He seems very happy now, and you know, guys like that were kind of rare, but that was a moment in time where I had some like cognitive dissonance. This moment, I was like, wait a minute, this guy, like, he's my friend. He's good at martial arts. He has my best interest in mind, but he's just flat out saying that there's a cult of Concho. Um, so that's not the best answer to your question, Chris, but that's the best I got.
No, it actually is a great answer because it highlights the fact that sometimes you can't tell on day 1 or day 2 or day
Yeah,
25 what you're involved in yet. You don't have enough data to know. You're new to the group. Everything is new. Everything is unfamiliar. The language is unfamiliar. The room is unfamiliar, or the location and the individuals. You have to learn who all these people are, and they're gonna and all of this. Any group, we all run into that. This is why we're all generally speaking, we're either quiet and kind of listening, or we're overcompensating and are ridiculously obnoxious when we're first members of a group. When do you think then? What was the first sign? What was the first thing you can remember seeing that made you go, wait a second? Well, I mean, there was that conversation you just described, which was a great one. Was there an earlier point?
yeah. One of my really good friends at the time, and still a friend today. We don't talk as much as we used to. Great guy. Me and him met after I got my first degree black belt, and he was maybe not quite a black belt yet. And he was so we were trained together. We became like BFFs, inseparable. And I remember when I was coming up training, there was a moment where I was sort of the golden boy because I was young, I was physical, athletic. I was training every day, twice a day, except Sundays, and even then sometimes, but I was there virtually every day, and I was like the unofficial uchideshi. And even after I got my black belt, some people approach me and they're like, "Hey, do you know about our Uchideshi program? Like, is that something you might be interested in?" So, I felt good. I felt like all eyes were kind of on me, and it feels good to be sort of the up and comer. And then I was training with my friend, and he got his black belt in December, and then we left for like the holidays. We came back in January, and I remember me and him, we were like, dude, we're gonna go all the way together. We're both black belts now. We're gonna get our second degree, at the same time, and we had it all mapped out. I remember I got back in January, and I came in late one Sunday night, and he was there. A bunch of people were there training, and I saw him, gave him a hug, and he said, "Oh, I just signed the contract. I'm gonna be an Uchideshi." And this was 2008. And I remember that when he said that, mentally, I got very upset because, and it took me a long time to process and deal with these emotions. But I realized that he's going to be the new golden boy, and he took the opportunity that I didn't take, and for the rest of the year, he skyrocketed. This kid was an incredible martial artist. He got, 3 black belt ranks or something in 1 year, and I just got 1. So by the end of the year, he was way ahead of me. And actually, he started to associate more with the other Uchideshi. Um, and so I went through this whole internal struggle of dealing with, feelings of resentment and being replaced, and then realizing that I wasn't, like I would never quite be in that inner circle. And that was the first red flag, because I realized, I was like, why are you so upset about this? Like, you should be happy. And he doesn't affect you. You're on the same path. He's not slowing you down. But I it took me a while to realize that the reason I got so upset was I just realized that I was reliant on that group of people for like personal power to a degree.
Bingo. There it is.
Yeah.
I'm so glad you said that. We could talk about external factors to you, red flags you might have seen with the instructor or with some other students or in the environment, but you chose something inside yourself. And I think that's very, very important because that is something that requires only our own self awareness.
Hmm.
And it is hard to be able to know when you're getting involved in a group that is potentially cultish or potentially, not in your best interest. It's hard. It's designed to be hard. It's literally built that way. I mean, all the mechanisms and all the trappings and all the things at the beginning are all the things that are the best part of the experience. They're the things that are hooking you into it. And then you're like a fish, and then you're there. And and really the first sign is you should feel that hook in your
Yeah.
mouth. You know, that's the first thing you should feel. But
Yeah.
we cognitive dissonance our way out of that. We rationalize our way through that. We want it to work. We want it to be the right decision. We don't want to have been duped or been wrong or have made a stupid decision or something. So we brush it off and we move on. And that is where the critical thinking comes in. And I'm just going to stress this because I'm not a one-hit wonder. I'm not a one-note pony, but I will keep hitting on critical thinking because that is the tool that if you use it consciously, you could detect that and avoid years of trouble as a result. You, the generic audience out there, not you. Okay, so anyway, just wanted to highlight that point, and I'm really glad you brought that up that way because it's you've done some real thinking about this. You are definitely one of the more impressive people I have interviewed
In a cult.
coming out of a cult. Yeah, because you have done exactly what I've suggested that a lot of people do, which is you have taken the time to educate yourself about some of this stuff. You
Yeah, and
know.
I feel like a lot of that was because I kept training in martial arts.
Hmm.
So I always was kind of asking myself, like, are you really, did you free yourself? Because you're still going to a mat, you know? And so thinking about that and in some ways I talked about the older people that
Yep.
were there that how did they not know? I feel a lot of responsibility now that it's like it's my job to be that person because Brazilian Jiu Jitsu absolutely has obsessive young people in it that want to compete and they want to dedicate their lives. And I feel like I've talked a couple people out of doing that because that's sort of like my karma in life now is I have that role to play to maybe take someone aside and be like, hey, like think carefully about this. Like this won't give as much back to you as you think. Trust me.
Exactly. That's right. Well, I was really surprised one day, and I'll repeat this because I think it's fitting here. Joe Rogan, again, was talking about this, and he said his own decision about being an MMA fighter was made fairly early on when he realized he was going to get his ass kicked a lot because he wasn't good enough. He was good, but he wasn't good enough. And he said, if you're not good enough, you actually just shouldn't pursue it because
Yeah.
all you're doing is setting yourself up for a life of a lot of misery and a lot of beatings. And if you're not good enough, you're not going to get there. If you are good enough, great, go for it. But that's actually a fairly small number of people.
Oh my
You
God.
know,
Have you ever seen the video where he's talking to Brendan Schwab? Brendan Schaub? Yeah, Brendan Schaub.
not
Uh,
sure.
basically
Which
telling him he needs to quit MMA.
that actually might have been the quote I'm talking about. That might have been it, where he
Yeah,
says, get out.
was a high point of his sort of career. And I don't know what was said off camera, but basically that was one of his good friends who had suffered some horrific knockout losses at very high levels in the heavyweight division, which is the most dangerous
Yep.
at the UFC. And he sat him down and he basically, he wouldn't let him. And Brendan kind of tried to laugh it off, like, "Oh, you're so funny, you're such." And Rogan was like dead serious, and he's like, "It's time to go. Like, I care about you, and these people are just gonna keep murdering you. And you got tons of other stuff you could do. You're funny, you could do comedy." And I've talked, I remember one time talking to a guy in BJJ about that. He was gonna quit his job and just train. And he actually was pretty good. So it was a tougher thing because, maybe he could, but, Brazilian Jiu Jitsu is like MMA in that just no one is making money in that. Even UFC fighters are making very little money aside from that sort of golden handful of people. And then, of course, it's just not a path. I mean,
Not
no one
for
should
not
feel,
for as many people as think it is their path, and that's
yeah,
kind of the point, you know. Um, you have to. The other half of that, of course, is that you have to absolutely positively be completely dedicated to it. Like you got to
yeah,
be 100% all in. If you're
yeah.
not,
You
that
got to
was the other
believe
piece of that advice. If you're not 100%, if you're 99.5,
yeah.
forget it. Quit. Don't do it.
Yeah, you have to have almost like this unhealthy obsession. You have to have a hatred of losing, a fear of losing and being human. Like you kind of have to be like psychologically or pathologically. You have to have some sort of major, issue that is actually working in a productive way for you.
Exactly.
Health
Basically,
and
that's
stuff.
exactly right. Um, okay, man. This was very, very interesting. I'd like to move toward wrapping it up, and I'd like to ask you in that direction, how has life been since you left, first off?
Life has been great, actually. Like Sarah's pregnant. We're having our first kid in
Hey,
February.
congratulations.
Yeah, I eventually left Monterey, and Seibukan was a big thing. I was like, there's just too many memories here, and even I went back to Monterey a couple weeks ago, and it was very strange. Um, Actually, I helped kind of broker the sale of the Seibukan dojo, sort of.
Really?
Yeah, sort of behind the scenes. I met some guys that were doing Gracie Jiu Jitsu in Santa Cruz, and the guy, he was like, "Oh, I want to open a place in Monterey. Do you know a place?" And I was like, "Well," and at that time, Concho had moved and kind of shut down the dojo. And I said, "Well, I know this guy. He's kind of eccentric. He still owns this place." I said, "You can contact him, but just do not tell him that I referred you at all. Um, you just don't even mention me." And it actually all worked out. And now that place is still a martial arts school teaching a different martial art. But yeah, life has been really good, and honestly, I'm grateful because a lot of people left Sabucon and they just had nothing, um, and I've been kind of keeping up with people over the years, and like definitely 7 out of 10 of them are kind of not doing so hot. Um, but I'm still training. I'm really enjoying that. I'm in better shape now than I did, when I did Sabucon. Like I've become a full-time writer. This book has sort of changed my life and opened up a lot of opportunities. I work in kind of the martial arts industry. I'm a sports writer. I write for like grapplinginsider.com. I write for Sanibel.com. They make apparel. And then I have like a normal day job where I'm a staff writer at a nonprofit up here in Sacramento. So yeah, I'm very happy with where I am, and I don't see any path if I would have stayed in Sabucon that I would have been this happy long term, because I always would have been in competition for Concho's affection and attention, and leaving that codependent relationship allowed me to have a better relationship with everyone else in my life, my family. There's a lot of tension there, I think, that I didn't fully understand until I left. My wife and things like that.
I'll bet. I'll bet. Did you have many people saying, "Thank God you're finally out. We've been worried about you," anything like that?
Yeah, after in hindsight,
Yeah.
oh yeah, we've been worried about you. I'm like, really?
where? Well, where was the intervention?
I think yeah, I don't know how well I kept it a secret. I definitely, with my parents, I think I freaked them out early because I was so enthusiastic, so I never had a bad relationship with them throughout this, but it was good to kind of talk through some of that stuff with them. Yeah, it's funny, after I wrote the book, so many people came out and were like, yes, I totally agree. I had a couple like nasty grams on social media and stuff, but overwhelmingly people agreed.
Yeah, I've totally been there, done that. Every video, tons of positive comments. a few negative ones, and those are the ones that always stick in my craw.
Right. Yeah. It's still, it's tough to see criticism, but, that's part of being, if you want to do a podcast or if you want to write a book or whatever, you just got to be okay with that.
That's right. Exactly.
Yeah.
All right, man. Well, any other life lessons you'd like to share before we wrap up here?
No, not. I mean, I think if you are training right now and you're in a martial arts school, first, I think it's important to say that the vast majority of martial arts schools are just functional places filled with good people that are they're doing good things, and people in general are better off training martial arts than not. But I would also say that bad schools can be filled with good people, and they usually are, and that's what makes it tricky. And also, just if you can resist obsession, and also if you can understand that like your own identity should be formed organically by you, you shouldn't just like adopt someone else's identity and persona, then I think you'll be fine. But I think that when I was young, like I wasn't patient enough to just let my life play out and become the person that I was going to be. So I rushed to this manufactured identity, and martial arts seemed to be something that was really cool to me. So, what I'd say is that if you're training martial arts and maybe you've thought about some of these issues, just maybe ask yourself, like, do I need this in order to maintain the image of myself as a person? If the answer is yes, then maybe that's something to take a look at. Because then I think you're vulnerable maybe to get taken advantage of a little bit. Critical thinking, like you said.
Exactly. Beautiful, man. Well, Louis, thank you very much for taking the time. We've been at this for quite some time. We've covered a lot of territory here, and like I said, I've been very impressed by almost everything you have said here. It's been quite an interesting and wonderful experience. Thank you for doing this.
Yeah, thank you. I'm glad this was a longer kind of interview because, when it's shorter, it gets tough for me to really kind of get in depth. And I feel like in other interviews I've done, I haven't given the story the service it deserves. So this was great.
Awesome, man. Okay, well, folks, any questions, comments, or feedback out there that you have, please leave them in the comment section below here on YouTube or at sensiblyspeaking.com, where I will see them. And when we post this, I will let Louis know, so maybe he can hop by and check out any comments that are coming in on this as well. If there are questions for him directly, you might put them in the comment section too. And thanks for coming around and watching. And by the way, folks, if you find this podcast entertaining, informative, and educational, consider joining me on Patreon, because that is what keeps the lights on and the show going. Thanks for coming around. I will see you guys next week. Bye-bye.